Welcome to Storytime with Moog. I am Moog, and today we are reading The Trial by Franz Kafka, starting with chapter 8. But first, reading updates. Reading updates. I finished Finding Sophie. I finished it yesterday, which is great because my review for it is due tomorrow. I'll have that review up for patrons. If you didn't know, I do have a Patreon. If you want to hang out. I'll have that review up for patrons later this week. And I know I'm behind on a couple of reviews as well, but they'll be up soon, I promise. So I finished it. It was okay. It was fine. It is a thriller book. We're following these two parents who have lost their daughter, and we are going through their like day-to-day life and how they themselves take on the responsibility of finding her. And things get wild. I did enjoy the latter part more than I enjoyed the beginning part, but you know, you gotta go through to earn the things, yeah? So I did read that. I am also reading something else. I forgot the title and I didn't get very far into it, but it is a book that I feel like I can't just do audio. That was my plan, was to just listen to it on walks, and I can't do that because it is requiring me to pay more attention than what I was doing because I am easily distracted by pretty things on my walk. So I think I'm going to try getting like a physical, either ebook or regular book, and also listening to it. I haven't done that before where I'm doing both the listening and the reading at the same time, and I'm going to try it out to see what my experience is like for that, because who knows, maybe that's the best way for me to remember things that happen in stories. So I am reading that. I am forever reading Robin Hobb, and I think that's it. I checked out a cookbook today, and there are a lot of delicious looking things in there. I'm gonna try a couple of recipes in there, but then I might just buy it because it looks really good. I mean, I did take pictures of a couple of the recipes because, like, I'll probably have to return it before I can get to all of them, but I'm excited for it. So I think that's all that I am reading. So the plan is to finish this. We have 3 chapters and oodles of fun. Okay, so what happens last time? Last time we only had time to read one monster chapter. We only read chapter 7, which is insane. But basically, high notes of what happened. We met with a painter who is the painter who paints the pictures, the portraits of the judges. So we met with him on good word from the manufacturer because he might be able to help us in our case. And we're talking with the painter. There's like little girls who like keep wanting to be painted by him that are like hanging out in the hallway, that are like interrupting every once in a while. But the painter says that there are basically only 3 outcomes for this trial. One, you could absolutely be perfectly innocent, like you are innocent, and you get like fully exonerated, and then you just go and live your life. However, that rarely happens. The 2 others are deferment, and then the other one is like partial something. I don't remember. There was a word that he used, partial something. And the deferment is you just live in this very beginning time of the trial for forever. You just keep deferring things, like when you're supposed to have meetings or when you're supposed to have like trial dates, you just keep pushing it back, so you're forever living in this one space. The only problem is that you have to be very, very on top of your case and make sure that you are able to push everything along, or to push everything back for forever. And then the other way, the like partial one, is that you are like partially free, and then you get home, and then you get rearrested, and then you have to do this whole thing all over again, and then you'll probably get the same ruling when you get to the trial, and then you get home, and then you get rearrested again. So it's just like a continuous cycle. All of them, besides being like actually fully innocent, sound terrible. So, with that in mind, shall we? Chapter 8. Get comfortable. It's a long chapter. Chapter 8. Block. The businessman dismissing the lawyer. Kay had at last made the decision to withdraw his defense from the lawyer. It was impossible to remove his doubts as to whether this was the right decision, but this was outweighed by his belief in its necessity. This decision, on the day he intended to go see the lawyer, took a lot of strength he needed for his work. He worked exceptionally slowly. He had to remain in his office a long time, and it was already past 10 o'clock when he finally stood in front of the lawyer's door. Even before he rang, he considered whether it might not be better to give the lawyer notice by letter or telephone. A personal conversation would certainly be very difficult. Nonetheless, Kay did not actually want to do without it. If he gave notice by any other means, it would be received in silence or with a few formulated words, and unless Lenny could discover anything, Kay would never learn how the lawyer had taken his dismissal and what its consequences might be, in the lawyer's not unimportant opinion. But sitting in front of him and taken by surprise by his dismissal, Kay would be able easily to infer everything he wanted from the lawyer's face and behavior, even if he could not be induced to say very much. It was not even out of the question that Kay might, after all, be persuaded that it would be best to leave his defense to the lawyer and withdraw his dismissal. As usual, there was at first no response to Kay's ring at the door. Lenny could be a bit quicker, thought Kay. But he could at least be glad that there was nobody else interfering as usually happened, be it the man in his nightshirt or anyone else who might bother him. As Kay pressed on the button for the second time, he looked at the other door, but this time it, too, remained closed. At last, two eyes appeared at the spy hatch in the lawyer's door, although they weren't Lenny's eyes. Someone unlocked the door, but kept himself pressed against it as he called back inside. "It's him!" And only then did he open the door properly. Kay pushed against the door, as behind him he could already hear the key being hurriedly turned in the lock of the door to the other flat. When the door in front of him finally opened, he stormed straight into the hallway. Through the corridor which led between the rooms he saw Lenny, to whom the warning cry of the door opener had been directed, still running away in her nightshirt. He looked at her for a moment and then looked round at the person who had opened the door. It was a small, wizened man with a full beard. He held a candle in his hand. "Do you work here?" asked Kay. "No," answered the man. "I don't belong here at all. The lawyer is only representing me. I'm here on legal business." "Without your coat?" asked Kay, indicating the man's deficiency of dress with a gesture of his hand. "Oh, do forgive me," said the man, and he looked at himself in the light of the candle he was holding, as if he had not known about his appearance until then. "Is Lenny your lover?" asked Kay curtly. He had set his legs slightly apart. His hands, in which he held his hat, were behind his back. Merely by being in possession of a thick overcoat, he felt his advantage over this thin little man. "Oh, God," he said, and, shocked, raised one hand in front of his face as if in defense. "No, no, what can you be thinking?" "You look honest enough," said Kay with a smile, "but come along anyway." Kay indicated with his hat which way the man was to go and let it go ahead of him. "What is your name, then?" asked Kay on the way. "Block. I am a businessman," said the small man, twisting himself round as he thus introduced himself, although Kay did not allow him to stop moving. "Is that your real name?" asked Kay. "Of course it is," was the man's reply. "Why do you doubt it?" "Oh, I thought you might have some reason to keep your name secret," said Kay. He felt himself as much at liberty as is normally only felt in foreign parts when speaking with people of lower standing, keeping everything about himself to himself, speaking only casually about the interests of the other, able to raise him to a level above one's own, but also able, at will, to let him drop again. Kay stopped at the door of the lawyer's office, opened it, and, to the businessman who had obediently gone ahead, said, "Not so fast. Bring some light here." Kay thought Lenny might have hidden in here. He let the businessman search in every corner, but the room was empty. In front of the picture of the judge, Kay took hold of the businessman's braces to stop him moving on. "Do you know him?" he asked, pointing towards upwards with his finger. The businessman lifted the candle, blinked as he looked up, and said, "It's a judge." "An important judge?" asked Kay, and stood to the side and in front of the businessman so that he could observe what impression the picture had on him. The businessman was looking up in admiration. "He's an important judge." "You don't have much insight," said Kay. "He's the lowest of the lowest examining judges." "Well, I remember now," said the businessman as he lowered the candle. "That's what I've already been told." "Well, of course you have," called out Kay. "I'd forgotten about it, of course. You would already have been told." "But why? Why?" asked the businessman as he moved forwards towards the door, propelled by the hands of Kay. Outside in the corridor, Kay said, "You know where Lenny's hidden, do you?" "Hidden?" said the businessman. "No, but she might be in the kitchen cooking soup for the lawyer." "Why didn't you say that immediately?" asked Kay. "I was going to take you there, but then you called me back again," answered the businessman, as if confused by the contradictory commands. "You think you're very clever, don't you?" said Kay. "Now take me there." Kay had never been in the kitchen. It was surprisingly big and very well equipped. The stove alone was 3 times bigger than normal stoves, but it was not possible to see any detail beyond this, as the kitchen was, at the time, illuminated by no more than a small lamp hanging by the entrance. At the stove stood Lenny, in a white apron, as always, breaking eggs into a pot standing on a spirit lamp. "Good evening, Joseph," she said with a glance sideways. "Good evening," said Kay, pointing with one hand to a chair in a corner which the businessman was to sit on, and he did indeed sit down on it. Kay, however, went very close behind Lenny's back, leant over his shoulder, and said, "Who is this man?" Lenny put one hand around Kay as she stirred the soup with the other. She drew him forward toward herself and said, "He's a pitiful character, a poor businessman by the name of Block. Just look at him." The two of them looked back over their shoulders. The businessman was sitting on the chair that Kay had directed him to. He had extinguished the candle whose light was no longer needed, and pressed on the wick with his fingers to stop the smoke. "You were in your nightshirt," said Kay, putting his hand on her head and turning it back towards the stove. She was silent. "Is he your lover?" asked Kay. She was about to take hold of the pot of soup, but Kay took both her hands and said, "Answer me," she said. "Come into the office. I'll explain everything to you." "No," said Kay. "I want you to explain it here." She put her arms around him and wanted to kiss him. Kay, though, pushed her away and said, "I don't want you to kiss me now." "Joseph," said Lenny, looking at Kay imploringly, but frankly in the eyes, "you're not going to be jealous of Mr. Block now, are you? Rudy," she then said, turning to the businessman, "help me out, will you? I'm being suspected of something, you can see that. Leave the candle alone." It had looked as though Mr. Block had not been paying attention, but he had been following closely. I don't even know why you might be jealous, he said ingenuously. Nor do I, actually, said Kay, looking at the businessman with a smile. Lenny laughed out loud, and while Kay was not paying attention, took the opportunity of embracing him and whispering, "Leave him alone. You can see what sort of person he is. I've been helping him a little bit because he's an important client of the lawyer's, and no other reason. And what about you? Do you want to speak to the lawyer at this time of day? He's very unwell today. But if you want, I'll tell him you're here. But you can certainly spend the night with me. It's so long since you were last here. Even the lawyer has been asking about you. Don't neglect your case. And I've got some things to tell you that I've learned about. But now, before anything else, take your coat off." She helped him off with his coat, took the hat off his head, ran with the things into the hallway to hang them up. Then she ran back and saw the soup. "Do you want me to tell him you're here straight away, or take him his soup first?" "Tell him I'm here first," said Kay. He was in a bad mood. He had originally intended a detailed discussion of the business with Lenny, especially the question of his giving the lawyer notice. But now he no longer wanted to, because of the presence of the businessman. Now he considered his affair too important to let this little businessman take part in it and perhaps change some of his decisions. And so he called Lenny back, even though she was already on her way to the lawyer. "Bring him his soup first," he said. "I want him to get his strength up for the discussion with me. He'll need it." "You are a client of the lawyer's too, aren't you?" said the businessman quietly from his corner, as if he were trying to find this out. It was not, however, taken well. "What business is that of yours?" asked Kay, and Lenny said, "Will you be quiet? I'll take him his soup first, then, shall I?" And she poured the soup into a dish. "The only worry, then, is that he might go to sleep soon after he's eaten." "What I've got to say to him will keep him awake," said Kay, who still wanted to intimate that he intended some important negotiations with the lawyer. He wanted Lenny to ask him what it was, and only then to ask her advice. But, instead, she just promptly carried out the order he had given her. When she went over to him with the dish, she deliberately brushed against him and whispered, "I'll tell him you're here as soon as he's eaten the soup so that I can get you back as soon as possible." "Just go," said Kay. "Just go." "Be a bit more friendly," she said, and, still holding the dish, turned completely round once more in the doorway. Kay watched her as she went. The decision had finally been made that the lawyer was to be dismissed. It was probably better that he had not been able to discuss the matter any more with Lenny beforehand. She hardly understood the complexity of the matter. She would certainly have advised him against it, and perhaps would even have prevented him from dismissing the lawyer this time. He would have remained in doubt and unease, and eventually have carried out his decision after a while anyway, as this decision was something he could not avoid. The sooner it was carried out, the more harm would be avoided. And moreover, perhaps the businessman had something to say on the matter. Kay turned round. The businessman hardly noticed it as he was about to stand up. "Stay where you are," said Kay, and pulled up a chair beside him. "Have you been a client of the lawyer's for a long time?" asked Kay. "Yes," said the businessman, "a very long time." "How many years has he been representing you so far, then?" asked Kay. "Well, I don't know how you mean," said the businessman. "He's been my business lawyer. I buy and sell cereals. He's been my business lawyer since I took the business over, and that's about 20 years now. But perhaps you mean my own trial, and he's been representing me in that since it started, and it's been more than 5 years. Yes, well over 5 years." He then added, pulling out his old briefcase, "I've got everything written down. I can tell you the exact dates if you'd like. It's so hard to remember everything. Probably my trial's been going on much longer than that. It started soon after the death of my wife, and that's been more than 5.5 years now." Kay moved in closer to him. "So The lawyer takes on ordinary legal business, does he? He asked. This combination of criminal and commercial business seemed surprisingly reassuring for Kay.
Oh, yes, said the businessman. And then he whispered, they even say he's more efficient in jurisprudence than he is in other matters.
But then he seemed to regret saying this, and he laid a hand on Kay's shoulder and said, please don't betray me to him, will you? Kay patted his thigh to reassure him and said, no, I don't betray people. He can be so vindictive, you see, said the businessman. I'm sure he won't do anything against such a faithful client as you, said Kay.
Oh, he might do, said the businessman. When he gets cross, it doesn't matter who it is, and anyway, I'm not really faithful to him.
How's that, then? Asked Kay.
I'm not sure I should tell you about it, said the businessman, hesitatingly.
I think it'll be all right, said Kay.
Well, then, said the businessman, I'll tell you about some of it, but you'll have to tell me a secret, too. Then we can support each other with the lawyer.
You are very careful, said Kay. But I'll tell you a secret that will set your mind completely at ease. Now tell me, in what way have you been unfaithful to the lawyer?
I've,
said the businessman hesitatingly, and in a tone as if he were confessing something dishonorable.
I've taken on other lawyers besides him.
Well, that's not so serious, said Kay, a little disappointed.
It is here,
said the businessman, who had had some difficulty breathing since making this confession, but who now, after hearing Kay's comment, began to feel more trust for him.
That's not allowed. And it's allowed at least of all to take on petty lawyers when you've already got a proper one. And that's just what I have done. Besides him, I've got 5 petty lawyers.
5? Exclaimed Kay, astonished at this number.
5 lawyers besides this one?
The businessman nodded.
I'm even negotiating with a 6th one.
But why do you need so many lawyers? Asked Kay.
I need all of them, said the businessman.
Would you mind explaining that to me? Asked Kay.
Oh, I'd be glad to, said the businessman. Most of all, I don't want to lose my case. Well, that's obvious. So that means I mustn't neglect anything that might be of use to me, even if there's very little hope of a particular thing being of any use. I can't just throw it away. So everything I have, I've put to use in my case. I've taken all the money out of my business. For example, the offices for my business used to occupy nearly a whole floor, but now all I need is a little room at the back where I work with one apprentice. It wasn't just using up money that caused the difficulty, of course. It was much more to do with me not working at the business as much as I used to. If you want to do something about your trial, don't have much time for anything else.
So, you're also working at the court yourself? Asked Kay.
That's just what I want to learn more about.
Like, that's just what I want to learn more about. Wrong voice, excuse me.
Well, I can't tell you very much about that, said the businessman. At first I tried to do that too, but I soon had to give it up again. It wears you out too much, and it's really not much use, and it turned out to be quite impossible to work there yourself and to negotiate. At least for me it was. It's a heavy strain there, just sitting and waiting. You know yourself what the air is like in those offices.
Well, how do you know I've been there then? Asked Kay.
I was in the waiting room myself when you went through.
What a coincidence that is, exclaimed Kay, totally engrossed and forgetting how ridiculous the businessman had seemed to him earlier.
You saw me. You were in the waiting room when I went through. Yes, I did go through it one time. It isn't such a big coincidence, said the businessman. I'm there nearly every day.
I expect I'll have to go there quite often myself now, said Kay. Although I can hardly expect to be shown the same respect as I was then, they all stood up for me. They must have thought I was a judge.
No, said the businessman. We were greeting the servant of the court. We knew you were a defendant. That sort of news spreads very quickly.
So you already knew about that? Said Kay. The way I behaved must have seemed very arrogant to you. Did you criticize me for it afterwards?
No, said the businessman. Quite the opposite. That was just stupidity.
What do you mean, stupidity? Asked Kay.
Why are you asking about it?
Said the businessman in some irritation.
You still don't seem to know the people there, and you might take it wrong. Don't forget, in proceeding like this, there are always lots of different things coming up to talk about. Things that you just can't understand with reason alone. You just get too tired and distracted for most things, and so instead, people rely on superstition. I'm talking about the others, but I'm no better myself. One of these superstitions, for example, is that you can learn a lot about the outcome of a defendant's case by looking at his face, especially the shape of his lips. There are lots who believe that, and they said that they could see from the shape of your lips that you will definitely be found guilty very soon. I repeat that all this is just a ridiculous superstition, and in most cases it's completely disproved by the facts. But when you live in that society, it's hard to hold yourself back from beliefs like that. Just know how much effect that superstition can have. You spoke to one of them there, didn't you? He was hardly able to give you an answer. There are lots of things there that can make you confused, of course, but one of them, for him, was the appearance of your lips. He told us all later he thought he could see something in your lips that meant he'd be convicted himself.
On my lips? Asked Kay, pulling out a pocket mirror and examining himself. I can see nothing special about my lips. Can you?
Nor can I, said the businessman. Nothing at all.
These people are so superstitious, exclaimed Kay.
Isn't that what I just told you?
Asked the businessman. Do you then have that much contact with each other? Exchanging each other's opinions? Said Kay.
I've kept myself completely apart so far. They don't normally have much contact with each other, said the businessman. That would be impossible. There are so many of them. And they don't have much in common either. If a group of them ever thinks they have found something in common, it soon turns out they were mistaken. There's nothing you can do as a group where the court's concerned. Each case is examined separately. The court is very painstaking, so there's nothing to be achieved by forming into a group. Only sometimes an individual will achieve something in secret, and it's only when that's been done the others learn about it. Nobody knows how it was done, so there's no sense of togetherness. You meet people now and then in the waiting rooms, but we don't talk much there. The superstitious beliefs were established a long time ago, and they spread all by themselves.
I saw those gentlemen in the waiting room, said Kay. It seems so pointless for them to be waiting in that way.
Waiting is not pointless, said the businessman. It's only pointless if you try and interfere yourself. I told you just now I've got 5 lawyers besides this one. You might think I thought it myself at first. You might think I could leave the whole thing entirely up to them now. That would be entirely wrong. I could leave it up to them less than when I had just the one. Maybe you don't understand that, do you?
No, said Kay, and to slow the businessman down who had been speaking too fast, he laid his hand on the businessman's to reassure him. But I like just to ask you to speak a little more slowly. There are many very important things for me, and I can't follow exactly what you're saying.
You're quite right to remind me of that, said the businessman. You're new to all this, a junior. Your trial is 6 months old, isn't it? Yes, I've heard about it. Such a new case. But I've already thought all these things through countless times. To me, they're the most obvious things in the world.
You must be glad your trial has already progressed so far, are you? Asked Kay. He did not wish to ask directly how the businessman's affairs stood, but received no clear answer anyway.
"Yes, I've been working at my trial for 5 years now," said the businessman as his head sank. "That's no small achievement."
Then he was silent for a while. Kay listened to hear whether Lenny was on her way back. On the one hand, he did not want her to come back too soon, as he still had many questions to ask, and did not want her to find him in this intimate discussion with the businessman. But on the other hand, it irritated him that she stayed so long with the lawyer when Kay was there, much longer than she needed to give him his soup.
"I still remember it exactly,"
The businessman began again, and Kay immediately gave him his full attention.
"when my case was as old as yours is now. I only had this one lawyer at that time, but I wasn't very satisfied with him."
Now I'll find out everything, thought Kay, nodding vigorously as if he could thereby encourage the businessman to say everything worth knowing.
"My case," the businessman continued, "didn't move on at all. There were some hearings that took place, and I went to every one of them, collected materials, handed all my business books to the court, which I later found was entirely unnecessary. I ran back and forth to the lawyer, and he submitted various documents to the court, too."
Various documents? Asked Kay.
"Yes, that's right,"
said the businessman. That's very important for me, said Kay. In my case, he's still working on the first set of documents. He still hasn't done anything. I see now that he's been neglecting me quite disgracefully.
"There can be lots of good reasons why the first documents still aren't ready," said the businessman. "And anyway, it turned out later on that the ones he submitted for me were entirely worthless. I even read one of them myself. One of the officials at the court was very helpful. It was very learned, and it didn't actually say anything. Most of all, there was lots of Latin, which I can't understand, then pages and pages of general appeals to the court, then lots of flattery for particular officials. They weren't named, these officials, but anyone familiar with the court must have been able to guess who they were. Then there was self-praise by the lawyer, where he humiliated himself to the court in a way that was downright dog-like, and then endless investigations of cases from the past which were supposed to be similar to mine, although as far as I was able to follow them, these investigations had been carried out very carefully. Now, I don't mean to criticize the lawyer's work with all of this, and the document I read was only one of many, but even so, this is something I will say. At that time, I couldn't see any progress in my case at all."
And what sort of progress had you been hoping for? Asked Kay.
"That's a very sensible question,"
said the businessman with a smile.
"It's only very rare that you see any progress in these proceedings at all. But I didn't know that then. I'm a businessman, much more in those days than now. I wanted to see some tangible progress. It should all have been moving to some conclusion, or at least should have been moving on in some way according to the rules. Instead of which there was just more hearings, and most of them were through the same things anyway. I had the answers of Pat like in a church service. There were messengers from the court coming to me at work several times a week, or they came to me at home or anywhere else they could find me, and that was very disturbing, of course. But at least now things are better in that respect. It's much less disturbing when they contact you by telephone. And rumors about my trial even started to spread among some of the people I do business with, and especially my relations. So I was being made to suffer in many different ways, but there was still not the slightest sign that even the first hearing would take place soon. So I went to the lawyer and complained about it. He explained all to me at length, but refused to do anything I asked for. No one has any influence on the way the trial proceeds, he said. I try and insist on it in any of the documents submitted, like I was asking, was simply unheard of and would do harm to both him and me. I thought to myself, what this lawyer can't or won't do, another lawyer will. So I looked round for other lawyers. And before you say anything, none of them asked for a definite date for the main trial, and none of them got one. And anyway, apart from one exception, which I'll talk about in a minute, it really is impossible. There's that one thing that lawyer didn't mislead me about. But besides, I had no reason to regret turning to other lawyers. Perhaps you've already heard how Dr. Hold talks about the petty lawyers. He probably made them sound very contemptible to you, and he's right. They are contemptible. But when he talks about them and compares them with himself and his colleagues, there's a small error running through what he says, and just for your interest, I'll tell you about it. When he talks about the lawyers he mixes with the sets, oops, when he talks about the lawyers he mixes with, he sets them apart by calling them great lawyers. That's wrong. Anyone can call himself great if he wants to, of course, but in this case only the usage of the court can make that distinction. You see, the court says that besides the petty lawyers, there are also minor lawyers and great lawyers. This one and his colleagues are only minor lawyers, and the difference in rank between them and the great lawyers who I've only ever heard about and seen, and never seen, is incomparably greater than between the minor lawyers and the despised petty lawyers. The great lawyers? Asked Kay. Who are they? How do you contact them? You've never heard about them, then? Said the businessman. There's hardly anyone who's been accused who doesn't spend a lot of time dreaming about the great lawyers once he's heard about them. It's best if you don't let yourself be misled in that way. I don't know who the great lawyers are, and there's probably no way of contacting them. I don't know of any case I can talk about with certainty where they've taken any part. They do defend a lot of people, but you can't get hold of them by your own efforts. They only defend those who they want to defend. And I don't suppose they ever take on cases that haven't already got past the lower courts. Anyway, it's best not to think about them, as if you do, it makes the discussion with the other lawyers, all their advice and all that they do manage to achieve, seem so unpleasant and useless. I had that experience myself, just wanted to throw everything away and lay at home in bed and hear nothing more about it. But that, of course, would be the stupidest thing you could do, and you wouldn't be left in peace in bed for very long either. So, you weren't thinking about the great lawyers at that time? Asked Kay. Not for very long, said the businessman, and smiled again. You can't forget about them entirely, I'm afraid, especially in the night when these thoughts come so easily. But I wanted immediate results in those days, so I went to the petty lawyers. Well, look at you two, sat huddled together, called Lenny, as she came back with the dish and stood in the doorway. They were indeed sat close together. If either of them turned his head even slightest, it would have knocked against the others. The businessman was not only very small, but also very hunched down so that Kay was forced to bend down low if he wanted to hear everything. Not quite yet, called out Kay to turn Letty away, his hand still resting on the businessman's hand, twitching with impatience. He wanted me to tell him about my trial, said the businessman to Lenny. Carry on, then, carry on, she said. She spoke to the businessman with affection, but at the same time with condescension. Kay did not like that. He had begun to learn that the man was of some value, after all. He had experience at least, and he was willing to share it. Lenny was probably wrong about him.
He watched her in irritation as Lenny now took the candle from the businessman's hand, which he had been holding on to all this time, wiped his hand with her apron, then knelt beside him to scratch off some wax that had dripped from the candle onto his trousers. "You were about to tell me about the petty lawyers," said Kay, shoving Lenny's hand away with no further comment. "What's wrong with you today?" asked Lenny, tapped him gently, and carried on with what she had been doing.
"Yes, the petty lawyers,"
said the businessman, putting his hand to his brow as if thinking hard. Kay wanted to help him and said, "You wanted immediate results, and so you went to the petty lawyers."
"Yes, that's right,"
said the businessman, but did not continue with what he'd been saying. Maybe he doesn't want to speak about it in front of Lenny, thought Kay, suppressing his impatience to hear the rest straight away, and stopped trying to press him. "Have you told him I'm here?" he asked Lenny. "Of course I have," she said. "He's waiting for you. Leave Block alone now. You can talk to Block later. He'll still be here." Kay still hesitated. "You'll still be here?" he asked the businessman, waiting to hear the answer from him and not wanting Lenny to speak about the businessman as if he weren't there. He was full of secret resentment toward Lenny today. And once more it was only Lenny who answered. "Oh, he often sleeps here." "He sleeps here?" exclaimed Kay. He had thought the businessman would just wait there for him while he quickly settled his business with the lawyer, and then they would leave together to discuss everything thoroughly and undisturbed. "Yes," said Lenny. "Not everyone's like you, Joseph, allowed to see the lawyer at any time you like. Don't even seem surprised that the lawyer, despite being ill, still receives you at 11 o'clock at night. You take it too far. You take it far too much for granted, what your friends do for you. Well, your friends, or at least I do. We like to do things for you. I don't want or need any more thanks than that you're fond of me." Fond of you, thought Kay, at first, and only then it occurred to him. Well, yes, I'm fond of her. Nonetheless, what he said, forgetting all the rest, was, "He receives me because I am his client. If I needed anyone's help, I'd have to beg and show gratitude whenever I do anything." "He's really nasty today, isn't he?" Lenny asked the businessman. "Now it's me who's not here," thought Kay, and nearly lost his temper with the businessman when, with the same rudeness as Lenny, he said, "The lawyer also has other reasons to receive him. His case is much more interesting than mine, and it's only at its early stages, too. It probably hasn't progressed very far, so the lawyer still likes to deal with him. That'll all change later on." Yeah, said Lenny, looking at the businessman and laughing. "He doesn't half talk," she said, turning to face Kay. "You can't believe a word he says. He's as talkative as he is sweet. Maybe that's why the lawyer can't stand him. At least, he only sees him when he's in the right mood. I've already tried hard to change that, but it's impossible. Just think, there are times when I tell him Block's here, and he doesn't receive him until 3 days later. And if Block isn't on the spot when he's called, then everything's lost, and it all has to start all over again. That's why I let Block sleep here. It wouldn't be the first time Dr. Hold has wanted to see him in the night, so now Block is ready for that. Sometimes, when he knows Block is still here, he'll even change his mind about letting him in to see him." Kay looked questioningly at the businessman. The latter nodded, and although he had spoken quite openly with Kay earlier, seemed to be confused with shame as he said,
"Yes, later on you become very dependent on your lawyer."
"He's only pretending to mind," said Lenny. "He likes to sleep here, really. He's often said so." She went over to a little door and shoved it open. "Do you want to see his bedroom?" she asked. Kay went over to the low, windowless room and looked in front of the doorway. The room contained a narrow bed, which filled it completely, so that to get into the bed you would need to climb over the bedpost. At the head of the bed there was a niche in the wall where, fastidiously tidy, stood a candle, a bottle of ink, and a pen with a bundle of papers which were probably to do with the trial. "You sleep in the maid's room?" asked Kay as he went back to the businessman.
Letty's let me have it, answered the businessman. It has many advantages.
Kay looked long at him. His first impression of the businessman had perhaps not been right. He had experience as his trial had already lasted a long time, but he had paid a heavy price for this experience. Kay was suddenly unable to bear the sight of the businessman any longer. "Bring him to bed, then," he called to Lenny, who seemed to understand him. For himself, he wanted to go to the lawyer and, by dismissing him, free himself from not only the lawyer, but also from Lenny and the businessman. But before he had reached the door, the businessman spoke to him gently. "Excuse me, sir," he said, and Kay looked round crossly. "You've forgotten your promise," said the businessman, stretching his hand out to Kay imploringly from where he sat. "You were going to tell me a secret." "That is true," said Kay, as he glanced at Lenny, who was watching him carefully to check on her. "So listen. It's hardly a secret now, anyway. I'm going to see the lawyer now, to sack him."
"He's sacking him,"
yelled the businessman, and he jumped up from his chair and ran round the kitchen with his arms in the air. He kept yelling, "He's sacking his lawyer." Lenny tried to rush at Kay, but the businessman got in her way so that she shoved him away with her fists. Then, still with her hands balled into fists, she ran after Kay, who, however, had been given a long start. He was already inside the lawyer's room by the time Lenny caught up with him. He had almost closed the door behind himself, but Lenny held the door open with her foot, grabbed his arm, and tried to pull him back. But he put such pressure on her wrist that, with a sigh, she was forced to release him. She did not dare go into the room straight away, and Kay locked the door with the key. "I've been waiting for you a very long time," said the lawyer from his bed. He had been reading something by the light of a candle, but now he laid it onto the bedside table and put his glasses on, looking at Kay sharply through them. Instead of apologizing, Kay said, "I'll be leaving again soon." As he had not apologized, the lawyer ignored what Kay said and replied, "I won't let you in this late again next time." "I find that quite acceptable," said Kay. The lawyer looked at him quizzically. "Sit down," he said. "As you wish," said Kay, drawing a chair up to the bedside table and sitting down. "It seemed to me that you locked the door," said the lawyer. "Yes," said Kay. "It was because of Lenny." He had no intention of letting anyone off lightly. But the lawyer asked him, "Was she being importunate again?" "Importunate?" asked Kay. "Yes," said the lawyer, laughing as he did so, had a fit of coughing, and then, once it had passed, began to laugh again. "I'm sure you must have noticed how importunate she can be sometimes," he said, and patted Kay's hand, which Kay had rested on the bedside table, and which he now snatched back. "You don't attach much importance to it, then?" said the lawyer, when Kay was silent. "So much the better. Otherwise I might have needed to apologize to you. It is a peculiarity of Lenny's. I've long since forgiven her for it, and I wouldn't be talking of it now if you hadn't locked the door just now. Anyways, perhaps I should at least explain this peculiarity of hers to you, but you seem rather disturbed, the way you're looking at me, and so that's why I'll do it. This peculiarity of hers consists of this. Lenny finds most of the accused attractive. She attaches herself to each of them, loves each of them, even seems to be loved by each of them. Then she sometimes entertains me by telling me about them, when I allow her to. I am not so astonished by all of this as you seem to be. If you look at them in the right way, the accused really can be attractive, quite often. But that is a remarkable, and to some extent scientific phenomenon. Being indicted does not cause any clear, precisely definable change in a person's appearance, of course. But it's not like with other legal matters. Most of them remain in their usual way of life, and
If they have a good lawyer looking after them, the trial doesn't get in their way. But there are, nonetheless, those who have experience in these matters who can look at a crowd, however big, and tell you which among them is facing a charge. How can they do that, you will ask? My answer will not please you. It is simply that those who are facing a charge are the most attractive. It cannot be their guilt that makes them attractive, as not all of them are guilty. At least, that's what I, as a lawyer, have to say. And nor can it be the proper punishment that has made them attractive, as not all of them are punished. So it can be only that the proceedings leveled against them take some kind of hold on them. Whatever the reason, some of these attractive people are indeed very attractive. But all of them are attractive, even Block, pitiful worm as he is.
As the lawyer finished what he was saying, Kay was fully in control of himself. He had even nodded conspicuously at his last few words in order to confirm to himself the view he had already formed. That the lawyer was trying to confuse him, as he always did, by making general and irrelevant observations, and thus distract him from the main question of what he was actually doing for Kay's trial. The lawyer must have noticed that Kay was offering him more resistance than before, as he became silent, giving Kay the chance to speak himself, and then, as Kay also remained silent, he said,
Did you have a particular reason for coming to see me today?
Yes, said Kay, putting his hand up to slightly shade his eyes from the light of the candle so that he could see the lawyer better. I wanted to tell you that I'm withdrawing my representation from you, with immediate effect.
Do I understand you rightly?
Asked the lawyer, as he half raised himself in his bed and supported himself with one hand on the pillow. I think you do, said Kay, shifting stiffly upright as if waiting in ambush.
Well, you can certainly discuss this plan of yours,
said the lawyer after a pause. It's not a plan anymore, said Kay.
That may be, said the lawyer, but we still mustn't rush anything.
He used the word we, as if he had no intention of letting Kay go free, and as if, even if he could no longer represent him, he could still at least continue as his advisor. Nothing is being rushed, said Kay, standing slowly up and going behind his chair. Everything has been well thought out, and probably even for too long. The decision is final.
Then allow me to say a few words,
said the lawyer, throwing the bed cover to one side and sitting on the edge of the bed. His naked, white-haired legs shivered in the cold. He asked Kay to pass him a blanket from the couch. Kay passed him the blanket and said, You are running the risk of catching cold for no reason.
The circumstances are important enough, said the lawyer,
as he wrapped the bed cover around the top half of his body and then the blanket round his legs.
Your uncle is my friend, and in the course of time I've become fond of you as well. I admit that quite openly. There's nothing in that for me to be ashamed of.
It was very unwelcome for Kay to hear the old man speak in this touching way, as it forced him to explain himself more fully, which he would rather have avoided. And he was aware that it also confused him, even though it could never make him reverse his decision. Thank you for feeling so friendly toward me, he said. And I also realize how deeply involved you've been in my case, as deeply as possible for yourself, and to bring as much advantage as possible to me. Nonetheless, I have recently come to the conviction that it is not enough. I would naturally never attempt, considering that you are so much older and more experienced than I am, to convince you of my opinion. If I have ever unintentionally done so, then I beg your forgiveness, but, as you have just said yourself, the circumstances are important enough, and it is my belief that my trial needs to be approached with much vigor, much more vigor than has so far been the case.
I see, said the lawyer. You've become impatient.
I am not impatient, said Kay with some irritation, and he stopped paying so much attention to his choice of words. When I first came here with my uncle, you probably noticed I wasn't greatly concerned about my case, and if I wasn't reminded of it by force, as it were, I would forget about it completely. But my uncle insisted I should allow you to represent me, and I did so as a favor to him. I could have expected the case to be less of a burden than it had been, as the point of taking on a lawyer is that he should take on some of its weight. But what actually happened was the opposite. Before the trial was never such a worry for me as it has been since you've been representing me. When I was by myself, I never did anything about my case. I was hardly aware of it. But then, once there was someone representing me, everything was set for something to happen. I was always, without cease, waiting for you to do something, getting more and more tense. But you did nothing. I did get some information about the court from you that I probably could not have got anywhere else, but that can't be enough when the trial, supposedly in secret, is getting closer and closer to me. Kay had pushed the chair away and stood erect, his hands in his pocket of his frock coat. "After a certain point in the proceedings," said the lawyer quietly and calmly, "nothing new of any importance ever happens. So many litigants at the same stage in their trials have stood before me just like you are now and spoken in the same way." "Then these other litigants," said Kay, "have all been right, just as I am. That does not show that I'm not." "I wasn't trying to show you that you were mistaken," said the lawyer. "But I wanted to add that I expected better judgment from you than from the others, especially as I've given you more insight into the workings of the court and my own activities than I normally do. And now I'm forced to accept that, despite everything, you have too little trust in me. You don't make it easy for me." How the lawyer was humiliating himself to Kay. He was showing no regard for the dignity of his position, which on this point must have been at its most sensitive. And why did he do that? He did seem to be very busy as a lawyer as well, a rich man. Neither the loss of income nor the loss of a client could have been of much importance to him in themselves. He was moreover unwell and should have been thinking of passing work on to others. And despite all that, he held on tightly to Kay. Why? Was it something personal for his uncle's sake, or did he really see Kay's case as one that was exceptional, and hoped to be able to distinguish himself with it, either for Kay's sake or, and this possibility could never be excluded, for his friends at the court? It was not possible to learn anything by looking at him, even though Kay was scrutinizing him quite brazenly. It could almost be supposed he was deliberately hiding his thoughts as he waited to see what effect his words would have. But he clearly deemed Kay's silence to be favorable for himself, and he continued, "You will have noticed the size of my office, but that I don't employ any staff to help me. That used to be quite different. There was a time when several young lawyers were working for me, but now I work alone. This is partly to do with changes in the way I do business, in that I concentrate nowadays more and more on matters such as your own case, and partly to do with the ever deeper understanding that I acquire from these legal matters. I found that I could never let anyone else deal with this sort of work unless I wanted to harm both the client and the job I had taken on. But the decision to do all the work myself had its obvious result. I was forced to turn almost everyone away who asked me to represent them, and could only accept those I was especially interested in. Well, there are enough creatures who leap at every crumb I throw down, and they're not so very far away. Most importantly, I became ill from overwork. But despite that, I don't regret my decision. Quite possibly, I should have turned more cases away than I did, but it did turn out to be entirely necessary for me to devote myself fully to the cases I did take on, and the successful results showed that it was worth it. I once read a description of the difference between representing someone in ordinary legal matters and in legal matters of this sort, and the writer expressed it very well. This is what he said.
Some lawyers lead their clients on a thread until judgment is passed, but there are others who immediately lift their clients onto their shoulders and carry them all the way to the judgment and beyond. That's just how it is. But it was quite true when I said I never regret all this work. But if, as in your case, they are so fully misunderstood, well, then I come very close to regretting it.
All of this talking did more to make Kay impatient than to persuade him. From the way the lawyer was speaking, Kay thought he could hear what he could expect if he gave in. The delays and excuses would begin again. Reports of how the documents were progressing, how the mood of the court officials had improved, as well as all the enormous difficulties. In short, all that he had heard so many times before would be brought out again, even more fully. He would try to mislead Kay with hopes that were never specified, and to make him suffer with threats that were never clear. He had to put a stop to that. So he said, "What will you undertake on my behalf if you continue to represent me?" The lawyer quietly accepted even this insulting question and answered,
"I should continue with what I've already been doing for you."
"It's just what I thought," said Kay. "And now you don't need to say another word."
"I will make one more attempt,"
said the lawyer, as if whatever had been making Kay so annoyed was affecting him too.
"You see, I have the impression that you have not only misjudged the legal assistance I have given you, but also that misjudgment has led you to behave in this way. You seem, although you are the accused, to have been treated too well, or, to put it a better way, handled with neglect, with apparent neglect. Even that has its reasons. It is often better to be in chains than to be free. But I would like to show you how other defendants are treated. Perhaps you will succeed in learning something from it. What I will do is I will call Block in, unlock the door, and sit down here beside the bedside table."
"Be glad to," said Kay, and did as the lawyer suggested. He was always ready to learn something new. But to make sure of himself for any event, he added, "But you do realize that you are no longer to be my lawyer, don't you?"
"Yes," said the lawyer. "But you can still change your mind today, if you want to."
He lay back down in the bed, pulled the quilt up to his chin, and turned to face the wall. Then he rang. Lenny appeared almost the moment he had done so. She looked hurriedly at Kay and the lawyer to try and find out what had happened. She seemed to be reassured by the sight of Kay sitting calmly at the lawyer's bed. She smiled and nodded to Kay. Kay looked blankly back at her.
"Fetch Block,"
said the lawyer. But instead of going to fetch him, Lenny just went to the door and called out, "Block! To the lawyer!" Then, probably because the lawyer had turned his face to the wall and was paying no attention, she slipped in behind Kay's chair. From then on, she bothered him by leaning forward over the back of the chair, or, albeit very tenderly and carefully, she would run her hands through his hair and over his cheeks. Kay eventually tried to stop her by taking hold of one hand, and after some resistance, Lenny let him keep hold of it. Block came as soon as he was called, but he remained standing in the doorway and seemed to be wondering whether he should enter or not. He raised his eyebrows and lowered his head as if listening to find out whether the order to attend the lawyer would be repeated. Kay could have encouraged him to enter, but he had decided to make a final break, not only with the lawyer, but with everything in this home. So he kept himself motionless. Lenny was also silent. Block noticed that at least no one was chasing him away, and on tiptoe he entered the room. His face was tense. His hands were clenched behind his back. He left the door open in case he needed to go back again. Kay did not even glance at him. He looked instead only at the thick quilt under which the lawyer could not be seen, as he had squeezed up very close to the wall. Then his voice was heard. "Block here?" he asked. Block had already crept some way into the room, But this question seemed to give him first a shove in the breast and then another in the back. He seemed about to fall, but remained standing, deeply bowed, and said, "At your service, sir." "What do you want?" asked the lawyer. "You've come at a bad time."
"Wasn't I summoned?"
asked the Block, more to himself than to the lawyer. He held his hands in front of him as protection and would have been ready to run away any moment. "You were summoned," said the lawyer, "but you have still come at a bad time." Then, after a pause, he added, "You always come at a bad time." When the lawyer started speaking, Block had stopped looking at the bed but stared rather into one of the corners, just listening, as if the light from the speaker were brighter than Block could bear to look at. But it was also difficult for him to listen, as the lawyer was speaking into the wall and speaking quickly and quietly.
"Would you like me to go away again, sir?"
asked Block. "Well, you're here now," said the lawyer. "Stay." It was as if the lawyer had not done as Block had wanted, but instead threatened him with a stick, as now Block really began to shake. "I went to see," said the lawyer, "the third judge yesterday, a friend of mine, and slowly brought the conversation round to the subject of you. Do you want to know what he said?"
"Oh, yes, please,"
said Block. The lawyer did not answer immediately, so Block repeated his request and lowered his head as if about to kneel down. Then Kay spoke to him. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted. Lenny had wanted to stop him from calling out, and so he took hold of her other hand. It was not love that made him squeeze it and hold on to it so tightly. She sighed frequently and tried to disengage her hand from him, but Block was punished for Kay's outburst as the lawyer asked him, "Who is your lawyer?"
"You are, sir,"
said Block. "And who besides me?" the lawyer asked.
"No one besides you, sir,"
said Block. "And let there be no one besides me," said the lawyer. Block fully understood what that meant. He glowered at Kay, shaking his head violently. If these actions had been translated into words, they would have been coarse insults. Kay had been friendly and willing to discuss his own case with someone like this. "I won't disturb you any more," said Kay, leaning back in his chair. "You can kneel down or creep on all fours, whatever you like. I won't bother you with any more." But Block still had some pride, at least where Kay was concerned, and he went over to him, waving his fist, shouting as loudly as he dared while the lawyer was there.
"You shouldn't speak to me like that. That's not allowed. Why are you insulting me, especially here in front of the lawyer, where both of us, you and me, were only tolerated because of his charity? We're not a better person than me. You've been accused of something too. You're facing a charge too. If, in spite of that, you're still a gentleman, then I'm just as much a gentleman as you are, if not even more so. I want to be spoken to as a gentleman, especially by you. If you think being allowed to sit there and quietly listen while I creep on all fours, as you put it, makes you better than me, then there's an old legal saying you ought to bear in mind. If you are under suspicion, it's better to be moving than still, as if you're still, you can't be in the pan of the scales without knowing it and be weighed along with your sins."
Kay said nothing. He merely looked in amazement at this distracted being, his eyes completely still. He had gone through such changes in just the last few hours. Was it the trial that was throwing him from side to side in this way and stopped him knowing who was friend and who was foe? Could he not see the lawyer was deliberately humiliating him and had no other purpose today than to show off his power to Kay, and perhaps even thereby subjugate Kay? But if Block was incapable of seeing that, or if he so feared the lawyer that no such insight would even be of any use to him, how was it that he was either so sly or so bold as to lie to the lawyer and conceal from him the fact that he had other lawyers working on his behalf? And how did he dare to attack Kay, who could betray his secret any time he liked? But he dared even more than this. He went to the lawyer's bed and began there to make complaints about Kay. "Dr. Hood, sir," he said. "Did you hear the way this man spoke to me? You can count the length of his trial in hours, and he wants to tell me what to do when I've been involved in a legal case for 5 years. He even insults me. He doesn't know anything, but he insults me when I, as far as my weak ability allows, when I've made a close study of how to behave with the court, what we ought to do and what the court practices." "Don't let anyone bother you," said the lawyer, "and do what seems to you to be right." "I will," said Block, as if speaking to himself to give himself courage, and with a quick glance to the side he knelt down close beside the bed. "I'm kneeling now, Dr. Holt, sir," he said. But the lawyer remained silent. With one hand, Block carefully stroked the bed cover. In the silence while he did so, Lenny, as she freed herself from Kay's hands, said, "You're hurting me. Let go of me. I'm going over to Block." She went over to him and sat on the edge of the bed. Block was very pleased at this, and with lively but silent gestures he immediately urged her to intercede for him with the lawyer. It was clear that he desperately needed to be told something by the lawyer, although perhaps only so that he could make use of the information with his other lawyers. Lenny probably knew very well how the lawyer could be brought round. Pointed to his hand and pursed her lips as if making a kiss. Block immediately performed the hand kiss and, at further urging from Lenny, repeated it twice more. But the lawyer continued to be silent. Then Lenny leant over the lawyer as she stretched out. The attractive shape of her body could be seen, and bent over close to his face, she stroked his long white hair. That now forced him to give an answer. "I'm rather wary of telling him," said the lawyer, and his head could be seen shaking slightly, perhaps so that he could feel the pressure of Lenny's hand better. Block listened closely with his head lowered, as if by listening he were breaking an order. "What makes you so wary about it?" asked Lenny. Kay had the feeling he was listening to a contrived dialogue that had been repeated many times, that would be repeated many times more, and that for Block alone it would never lose its freshness. "What has his behavior been like today?" asked the lawyer, instead of an answer. Before Lenny said anything, she looked down at Block and watched him a short while as he raised his hands towards her and rubbed them together imploringly. Finally, she gave a serious nod, turned back to the lawyer and said, "He's been quiet and industrious." This was an elderly businessman, a man whose beard was long, and he was begging a young girl to speak on his behalf. Even if there was some plan behind what he did, there was nothing that could reinstate him in the eyes of his fellow man. Kay could now understand how the lawyer could have thought this performance could win him over. Even if he had done nothing earlier to make him want to leave, then this scene would have done so. It was almost humiliating, even for the onlooker. So these were the lawyer's methods, which Kay, unfortunately, had not been exposed to for long. To let the client forget about the whole world and leave him with nothing but the hope of reaching the end of his trial by this deluded means. He was no longer a client. He was the lawyer's dog. If the lawyer had ordered him to crawl under the bed as if it were a kennel and to bark out from under it, then he would have done so with enthusiasm. Kay listened to all of this, testing it and thinking it over as if he had been given the task of closely observing everything spoken here, inform a higher office about it, and write a report. "And what has he been doing all day?" asked the lawyer. "I kept him locked in the maid's room all day," said Lenny, "so that he wouldn't stop me doing my work. That's where he usually stays. From time to time I looked in through the spy hole to see what he was doing, and each time he was kneeling on the bed, reading the papers you gave him, propped up on the window sill. That made a good impression on me, as the window only opens onto an air shaft and gives hardly any light. It showed how obedient he is when he was even reading in those conditions.
"I'm pleased to hear it," said the lawyer. "But did he understand what he was reading?"
While this conversation was going on, Block continually moved his lips and was clearly formulating the answers he hoped Lenny would give. "Well, I can't give you any certain answer to that, of course," said Lenny. But I could see that he was reading thoroughly. He spent all day reading the same page, running his finger along the lines. Whenever I looked in on him, he sighed as if this reading was a lot of work for him. I expect the papers you gave him were very hard to understand.
"Yes," said the lawyer, "they certainly are that. And I really don't think he understood anything of them. But they should at least give him some inkling of just how hard a struggle it is and how much work it is for me to defend him. And who am I doing all this work for? I'm doing it. It's laughable even to say. I'm doing it for Block. He ought to realize what that means, too. Did he study without a pause?"
Almost without a pause, answered Lenny. Just the once he asked me for a drink of water, so I gave him a glassful through the window. Then at 8 o'clock I let him out and gave him something to eat. Block glanced sideways at Kay, as if he were being praised and had to impress Kay as well. He now seemed more optimistic. He moved more freely and rocked back and forth on his knees. This made his astonishment all the more obvious when he heard the following words from the lawyer.
"You speak well of him," said the lawyer. "But that's just what makes it difficult for me. You see, the judge did not speak well of him at all, neither about Block nor about his case."
"Didn't speak well of him?" asked Lenny. "How is that possible?" Block looked at her with such tension he seemed to think that although the judge's words had been spoken so long before, she would be able to change them in his favor.
"Not at all," said the lawyer. "In fact, he became quite cross when I started to talk about Block to him. 'Don't talk to me about Block,' he said. 'He is my client,' said I. 'You're letting me abuse you.' 'You're letting him abuse you,' he said. 'I don't think his case is lost yet,' said I. 'You're letting him abuse you,' he repeated. 'I don't think so,' said I. 'Block works hard in his case and always knows where it stands. He practically lives with me so that he always knows what's happening. You won't always find such enthusiasm as that. He's not very pleasant, personally, I grant you. His manners are terrible and he's dirty. But as far as the trial's concerned, he's quite immaculate.' I said immaculate, but I was deliberately exaggerating. Then he said, 'Block is sly, that's all. He's accumulated plenty of experience and knows how to delay proceedings. But there's more that he doesn't know than he does.' What do you think he'd say if he learned this trial still hasn't begun? If you told him they haven't even rung the bell to announce the start of proceedings?" "All right, Block, all right," said the lawyer.
As at these words Block had begun to raise himself on his trembling knees and clearly wanted to plead for some explanation. It was the first time the lawyer had spoken any clear words directly to Block. He looked down with his tired eyes, half blankly and half at Block, who slowly sank back down on his knees under his gaze.
"What the judge said has no meaning for you," said the lawyer. "You needn't be frightened at every word. If you do it again, I won't tell you anything else at all. It's impossible to start a sentence without you looking at me as if you were receiving your final judgment. You should be ashamed of yourself here in front of my client, and you're destroying the trust he has for me. Just what is it you want? You're still alive. You're still under my protection. There is no point in worrying. Somewhere you've read that the final judgment can often come without warning, from anyone at any time, and in the right circumstances. That's basically true. But it's also true that I dislike your anxiety and fear and see you don't have the trust in me you should have. Now what have I just said? I repeated something said by one of the judges. You know that there are so many various opinions about the procedure that they form into a great pile, and nobody can make any sense of them. This judge, for instance, sees proceedings as starting at a different point from where I do. A difference of opinion, nothing more. At a certain stage in the proceedings, tradition has it that a sign is given by ringing a bell. This judge sees that at the point at which proceedings begin. I can't set out all the opinions opposed to that view here, and you wouldn't understand it anyway. Suffice it to say that there are many reasons to disagree with him.
Embarrassed, Block ran his fingers through the pile of the carpet. His anxiety about what the judge had said had let him forget his inferior status towards the lawyer for a while. He thought only about himself, and turned the judge's words round to examine them from all sides. Block, said Lenny, as if reprimanding him, and taking hold of the collar of his shirt, pulled him up slightly higher. Leave the carpet alone and listen to what the lawyer is saying. There's a note? There's a note. So I turned the page and it says, "This chapter was left unfinished." That's cool. That's cool. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 8, and apparently it's unfinished. That's really cool. So, yes, I did know that this book was unfinished. Kafka did not complete it before he died. Wow, wow, wow. Ooh, ooh. Okay, so chapter 8. What has happened? What has happened? Okay, so chapter 8, Kay goes to the lawyer with the intention of letting him go, of firing him, basically. And so he decides to um make a stand while he still has the excitement, the vigor, all of these things. And he goes there and he meets this businessman. And this businessman is also been accused and going through the trials. And he has been through this for 5 years. And he's unable to actually tell us anything about his case. He's not able to say, like how it's proceeding, nothing like that. But Kay, of course, is very interested in this and like asking him a lot of questions about it, everything like that. And in exchange for this information, Kay has to tell a secret because the businessman, Block, is like, this is a secret, but I have 5 lawyers. And Kay is like, good heavens, 5 lawyers? Tell me more. And so Block continues to talk about like how he has five lawyers and how like they already met. Like, I've seen you and I know that you were accused and what you were going through. And I can, like, there's superstitions that all of these people have that just by your lips, people can tell if you're guilty, and you're going to be guilty. And so that's interesting. This is just wild. And Lenny is there. And so, like, uh, Kay, after speaking with Block, goes in to talk to the lawyer, and he's like, "Lawyer, listen up, Buttercup. I no longer want your services." And the lawyer is like, "Yes, you do." And Kay is like, "No, I don't." And so they have this back and forth. The lawyer is trying to convince him that he really does need him. And Kay is like, I could have just let all of this slide by. Like, I could have just continued to live my normal life and even have forgotten about the trial. But ever since getting a trial, or getting a lawyer, it has just consumed my life. And I thought that lawyers were supposed to take on the weight of all of this work, and you're not. Like, you're not doing anything. And so the lawyer is trying to continue to convince him that he does need him, and in doing so he brings Block in. And Block is, it's mentioned in there that Block is like the lawyer's dog. He's no longer the lawyer's client. And if the lawyer asked him to, go underneath the bed and bark like a dog, he would do it, and with enthusiasm. So it's interesting to see this scene and how the lawyer thinks that that's going to convince Kay to keep him on as a lawyer, and Kay is like being further confirmed that this is the right choice. Like, actually, no, I don't want a lawyer. Thank you. And that was the chapter. All right. Chapter 9. In the Cathedral. A very important Italian business contact of the bank had come to visit the city for the first time, and Kay was given the task of showing him some of its cultural sites. At any other time, he would have seen this job as an honor, but now, when he was finding it hard even to maintain his current position in the bank, he accepted it only with reluctance. Every hour that he could not be in the office was a cause of concern for him. He was no longer able to make use of his time in the office anything like as well as he had previously. He spent many hours merely pretending to do important work, but that only increased his anxiety about not being in the office. Then he sometimes thought he saw the deputy director, who was always watching, come into Kay's office, sit at his desk, look through his papers, receive clients who had almost become old friends of Kay, and lure them away from him. Perhaps he even discovered mistakes that seemed to threaten Kay from 1,000 directions when he was at work now, and which he could no longer avoid. So now, if he was ever asked to leave the office on business or even needed to make a short business trip, however much in honor it seemed, the task of this sort happened to have increased substantially recently. There was always the suspicion that they wanted to get him out of his office for a while and check his work, or at least the idea that they thought he was dispensable. It would not have been difficult for him to turn down most of these jobs, but he did not dare to do so because, if his fears had the slightest foundation, turning the jobs down would have been an acknowledgment of them. For this reason, he never demurred from accepting them, and even when he was asked to go on a tiring business trip lasting 2 days, he said nothing about having to go out in the rainy autumn weather when he had a severe chill, just in order to avoid the risk of not being asked to go. When, with a raging headache, he arrived back from his trip, he learned that he had been chosen to accompany the Italian business contact the following day. The temptation for once to turn the job down was very great, especially as it had no direct connection with business, but there was no denying that social obligations towards this business contact were in themselves important enough, only not for Kay, who knew quite well that he needed some successes at work if he was to maintain his position there, and that, if he failed in that, it would not help him even if this Italian somehow found him quite charming. He did not want to be removed from his workplace for even one day, as the fear of not being allowed back in was too great. He knew full well that the fear was exaggerated, but it still made him anxious. However, in this case it was almost impossible to think of an acceptable excuse. His knowledge of Italian was not great, but it was still good enough. The deciding factor was that Kay had nearly known a little about art history, and that this had become widely known around the bank in extremely exaggerated form, and that Kay had been a member of the Society for the Preservation of City Monuments, albeit only for business reasons. It was said that his Italian was an art lover, so the choice of Kay to accompany him was a matter of course. It was a very rainy and stormy morning when Kay, in a foul temper at the thought of the day ahead of him, arrived early at 7 o'clock in the office, so that he could at least do some work before his visitor would prevent him. He had spent half the night studying a book of Italian grammar so that he would be somewhat prepared, and was very tired. His desk was less attractive to him than the window, where he had spent far too much time sitting of late, but he resisted the temptation and sat down to his work. Unfortunately, just then the servitor came in and reported that the director had sent him to see whether the chief clerk was already in his office. If he was, then would he please be so kind as to come to his reception room, as the gentleman from Italy was already there. "I'll come straight away," said Kay. He put a small dictionary in his pocket, took a guide to the city's tourist sites under his arm that he had compiled for strangers, and went through the deputy director's office into that of the director. He was glad he had come into the office so early and was able to be of service immediately. Nobody could seriously have expected that of him. The deputy director's office was, of course, still as empty as the middle of the night. The servitor had probably been asked to summon him, too, but without success. As Kay entered the reception room, two men stood up from the deep armchairs where they had been sitting. The director gave him a friendly smile. He was clearly very glad that Kay was there. He immediately introduced him to the Italian, who shook Kay's hand vigorously and joked that somebody was an early riser. Kay did not quite understand whom he had in mind. It was moreover an odd expression to use, and it took Kay a little while to guess its meaning. He replied with a few bland phrases, which the Italian received once more with a laugh, passing his hand nervously and repeatedly over his blue-gray, bushy mustache. This mustache was obviously perfumed. It was almost tempting to come close to it and sniff. When they had all sat down and begun a light preliminary conversation, Kay was disconcerted to notice that he understood no more than fragments of what the Italian said. When he spoke very calmly, he understood almost everything, but that was very infrequent. Mostly the words gushed from his mouth, and he seemed to be enjoying himself so much his head shook. When he was talking in this way, his speech was usually wrapped up in some kind of dialect, which seemed to Kay to have nothing to do with Italian, but which the director not only understood, but also spoke, although Kay ought to have foreseen this, as the Italian came from the south of his country, where the director had also spent several years. Whatever the cause, Kay realized that the possibility of communicating with the Italian had been largely taken from him. Even his French was difficult to understand, and his mustache concealed the movements of his lips, which might have offered some help in understanding what he said. Kay began to anticipate many difficulties. He gave up trying to understand what the Italian said, with the director there, who could understand him so easily. It would have been pointless effort, and for the time being did no more than scowl at the Italian as he relaxed, sitting deep but comfortable in the armchair, as he frequently pulled at his short, sharply tailored jacket, and at one time lifted his arms in the air and moved his hands freely to try and depict something that Kay could not grasp, even though he was leaning forward and did not let the hands out of his sight. Kay had nothing to occupy himself but mechanically watch the exchange between the two men, and his tiredness finally made itself felt, to his alarm. Although fortunately in good time, he once caught himself nearly getting up, turning round, and leaving. Eventually the Italian looked at the clock and jumped up. After taking his leave from the director, he turned to Kay, pressing himself so close to him that Kay had to push his chair back just so that he could move. The director had, no doubt, seen the anxiety in Kay's eyes as he tried to cope with this dialect of Italian. He joined in with this conversation in a way that was so adroit and unobtrusive that he seemed to be adding no more than minor comments, whereas in fact he was swiftly and patiently breaking into what the Italian said so that Kay could understand. Kay learned in this way that the Italian first had a few business matters to settle, that he unfortunately had only a little time at his disposal, that he certainly did not intend to rush around to see every monument in the city, that he would much rather, at least as long as Kay would agree, it was entirely his decision, just see the cathedral, and to do so thoroughly. He was extremely pleased to be accompanied by someone who was so learned and so pleasant. By this he meant Kay, who was occupied not with listening to the Italian, but the director, and asked if he would be so kind, if the time was suitable, to meet him in the cathedral in 2 hours' time at about 10 o'clock. He hoped he would certainly be able to be there at that time. Kay made an appropriate reply. The Italian shook first the director's hand and then Kay's, then the director's again, and went to the door, half turned to the two men who followed him and continuing to talk without a break. Kay remained together with the director for a short while, although the director looked especially unhappy today. He thought he needed to apologize to Kay for something and told him they were standing intimately close together. He had thought at first he would accompany the Italian himself, but then he gave no more precise reason than this. Then he decided it would be better to send Kay with him. He should not be surprised if he could not understand the Italian at first. He would be able to very soon, and even if he really could not understand very much, he said it was not so bad, as it was really not so important for the Italian to be understood. And anyway, Kay's knowledge of Italian was surprisingly good. The director was sure he would get by very well. And with that, it was time for Kay to go. He spent the time still remaining to him with a dictionary, copying out obscure words he would need to guide the Italian around the cathedral. It was an extremely irksome task. Servitors brought him the mail. Bank staff came with various queries, and when they saw that Kay was busy, stood by the door and did not go away until he had listened to them. The deputy director did not miss the opportunity to disturb Kay, and came in frequently, took the dictionary from his hand and flicked through its pages, clearly for no purpose. When the door to the anteroom opened, even clients would appear from the half-darkness and bow timidly to him. They wanted to attract his attention, but were not sure whether he had seen them. All this activity was circling around Kay, with him at its center, while he compiled the list of words he would need, then looked them up in the dictionary, then wrote them out, then practiced their pronunciation, and finally tried to learn them by heart. The good intentions he had had earlier, though, seemed to have left him completely. It was the Italian who had caused him all this effort, and sometimes he became so angry with him that he buried the dictionary under some papers, firmly intending to do no more preparation. But then he realized he could not walk up and down in the cathedral with the Italian without saying a word, so, in an even greater rage, he pulled the dictionary back out again. At exactly 9:30, just when he was about to leave, there was a telephone call for him. Lenny wished him good morning and asked how he was. Kay, thanking her hurriedly, told her it was impossible for him to talk now, as he had to go to the cathedral. "To the cathedral?" asked Lenny. "Yes, to the cathedral." "What do you have to go to the cathedral for?" said Lenny. Kay tried to explain it to her briefly, but he had hardly begun when Lenny suddenly said, "They're harassing you." One thing that Kay could not bear was pity, that he had not wanted or expected. He took his leave of her with 2 words, but as he put the receiver back in its place, he said, half to himself and half to the girl on the other end of the line who could no longer hear him, "Yes, they're harassing me." But now the time was late, and there was almost a danger he would not be on time. He took a taxi to the cathedral. At the last moment he had remembered the album that he had had no opportunity to give to the Italian earlier, and so took it with him now. He held it on his knees and drummed impatiently on it during the whole journey. The rain had eased off slightly, but it was still damp, chilly, and dark. It would be difficult to see anything in the cathedral, but standing about on cold flagstones might well make Kay's chill much worse. The square in front of the cathedral was quite empty. Kay remembered how even as a small child he had noticed that nearly all the houses in this narrow square had the curtains at their windows closed most of the time, although today, with the weather like this, it was more understandable. The cathedral also seemed quite empty. Of course, no one would think of going there on a day like this. Kay hurried along both the side naves, but saw no one but an old woman who, wrapped up in a warm shawl, was kneeling at a picture of the Virgin Mary and staring up at it. Then, in the distance, he saw a church official who limped away through a doorway in the wall. Kay had arrived on time. It had struck 10 just as he was entering the building, but the Italian still was not there. Kay went back to the main entrance, stood there indecisively for a while, and then walked round the cathedral to the rain in case the Italian was waiting at another entrance. He was nowhere to be found. Could the director have misunderstood what time they had agreed on? How could anyone understand someone like that properly anyway? Whatever had happened, Kay would have to wait for him for at least half an hour. As he was tired, he wanted to sit down. He went back inside the cathedral. He found something like a small carpet on one of the steps. He moved it with his foot to a nearby pew, wrapped himself up tighter in his coat, put the collar up, and sat down. To pass the time, he opened the album and flicked through the pages a little, but soon had to give up as it became so dark that when he looked up, he could hardly make out anything in the side nave next to him. In the distance, there was a large triangle of candles flickering on the main altar. Kay was not certain whether he had seen them earlier. Perhaps they had only just been lit. Church staff creep silently as part of their job. You don't notice them. When Kay happened to turn round, he also saw a tall, stout candle attached to a column not far behind him. It was all very pretty, but totally inadequate to illuminate the pictures which were usually left in the darkness of the side altars and seemed to make the darkness all the deeper. It was discourteous of the Italian not to come, but it was also sensible of him. There would have been nothing to see. They would have had to content themselves with seeking out a few pictures with Kay's electric pocket torch and looking at them one small part at a time. Kay went over to a nearby side chapel to see what they could have hoped for. He went up a few steps to a low marble railing and leaned over it to look at the altar picture by the light of his torch. The eternal light hung disturbingly in front of it. The first thing that Kay partly saw and partly guessed at was a large knight in armor who was shown at the far edge of the painting. He was leaning on his sword that he had stuck into the naked ground in front of him, where only a few blades of grass grew here and there. He seemed to be paying close attention to something that was being played out in front of him. It was astonishing to see how he stood there without going any closer. Perhaps it was his job to stand guard. It was a long time since Kay had looked at any pictures, and he studied the night for a long time, even though he had continually to blink as he found it difficult to bear the green light of his torch. Then, when he moved the light to the other parts of the picture, he found an interment of Christ shown in the usual way. It was also a comparatively new painting. He put his torch away and went back to his place. There seemed to be no point in waiting for the Italian any longer, but outside it was certainly raining heavily, and as it was not so cold in the cathedral as Kay had expected, he decided to stay there for the time being. Close by him was the great pulpit. There were two plain golden crosses attached to its little round roof, which were lying almost flat, and whose tips crossed over each other. The outside of the pulpit's balustrade was covered in green foliage, which continued down to the column supporting it. Little angels could be seen among the leaves, some of them lively, and some of them still. Kay walked up to the pulpit and examined it from all sides. Its stonework had been sculpted with great care. It seemed as if the foliage had trapped a deep darkness between and behind its leaves and held it there prisoner. Kay lay his hand in one of these gaps and cautiously felt the stone. Until then, he had been totally unaware of this pulpit's existence. Then Kay happened to notice one of the church staff standing behind the next row of pews. He wore a loose, creased, black cassock. He held a snuff box in his left hand, and he was watching Kay. Now what does he want? Thought Kay. Do I seem suspicious to him? Does he want a tip? But when the man in the cassock saw that Kay had noticed him, he raised his right hand, a pinch of snuff still held between two fingers, and pointed in some vague direction. It was almost impossible to understand what this behavior meant. Kay waited a while longer, but the man in the cassock did not stop gesturing with his hand, and even augmented it by nodding his head. "Now what does he want?" asked Kay quietly. He did not dare call out loud here, but then he drew out his purse and pushed his way through the nearest pews to reach the man. He, however, immediately gestured to turn down this offer, shrugged his shoulders, and limped away. As a child, Kay had imitated riding on a horse with the same sort of movement as this limp. This old man is like a child, thought Kay. He doesn't have the sense for anything more than serving in a church. Look at the way he stops when I stop, and how he waits to see whether I'll continue. With a smile, Kay followed the old man all the way up the side nave, and almost as far as the main altar. All this time, the old man continued to point at something, but Kay deliberately avoided looking round. He was only pointing in order to make it harder for Kay to follow him. Eventually, Kay did stop following. He did not want to worry the old man too much, and he also did not want to frighten him away, completely in case the Italian turned up after all. When he entered the central nave to go back to where he had left the album, he noticed a small secondary pulpit on a column almost next to the stalls by the altar where the choir sat. It was very simple, made of plain, white stone, and so small that from a distance it looked like an empty niche where the statue of a saint ought to have been. It certainly would have been impossible for the priest to take a full step back from the balustrade, and although there was no decoration on it, the top of the pulpit curved in exceptionally low, so that a man of average height would not be able to stand upright and would have to remain bent forward, over the balustrade. In all, it looked as if it had been intended to make the priest suffer. It was impossible to understand why this pulpit would be needed, as there were also the other ones available, which were large and so artistically decorated. And Kay would certainly not have noticed this little pulpit if there had not been a lamp fastened above it, which usually meant there was a sermon about to be given. So was a sermon to be given now, in this empty church? Kay looked down at the steps which, pressed close against the column, held up to the pulpit. They were so narrow, they seemed to be there as decoration on the column rather than for anyone to use. But under the pulpit, Kay grinned in astonishment, there really was a priest, standing with his hand on the handrail, ready to climb the steps and looking at Kay. Then he nodded very slightly, so that Kay crossed himself and genuflected as he should have done earlier. With a little swing, the priest went up into the pulpit with short, fast steps. Was there really a sermon about to begin? Maybe the man in the cassock had not really been so demented, and had meant to lead Kay's way to the preacher, which in this empty church would have been very necessary. And there was also, somewhere in front of a picture of the Virgin Mary, an old woman who should have come to hear the sermon. And if there was to be a sermon, why had it not been introduced on the organ? But the organ remained quiet, and merely looked out weakly from the darkness of its great height. Kay now considered whether he should leave as quickly as possible. If he did not do it now, there would be no chance of doing so during the sermon, and he would have to stay there for as long as it lasted. He had lost so much time when he should have been in his office. There had long been no need for him to wait for the Italian any longer. He looked at his watch. It was 11. But could there really be a sermon given? Could Kay constitute the entire congregation? How could he, when he was just a stranger who wanted to look at the church? That, basically, was all he was. The idea of a sermon, now, at 11 o'clock, on a work-day, in hideous weather, was nonsense. The priest, there was no doubt that he was a priest, a young man with a smooth, dark face, was clearly going up there just to put the lamp out after somebody had lit it by mistake. But there had been no mistake. The priest seemed rather to check that the lamp was lit and turned it a little higher. Then he slowly turned to face the front and leant down on the balustrade, gripping its angular rail with both hands. He stood there like that for a while, and, without turning his head, looked around. Kay had moved back a long way and leant his elbows on the front pew. Somewhere in the church, He could not have said exactly where. He could make out the man in the cassock hunched under his bent back and at peace, as if his work were completed. In the cathedral it was now very quiet, but Kay would have to disturb that silence. He had no intention of staying there. If it was the priest's duty to preach at the certain time regardless of the circumstances, then he could, and he could do it without Kay's taking part, and Kay's presence would do nothing to augment the effect of it. So Kay began slowly to move, felt his way on tiptoe along the pew, arrived at the broad aisle, and went along it, without being disturbed, except for the sound of his steps, however light, which rang out on the stone floor and resounded from the vaulting, quiet but continuous at a repeating, regular pace. Kay felt slightly abandoned as, probably observed by the priest, he walked by himself between the empty pews, and the size of the cathedral seemed to be just at the limit of what a man could bear. When he arrived back at where he had been sitting, he did not hesitate, but simply reached out for the album he had left there and took it with him. He had nearly left the area covered by pews and was close to the empty space between himself and the exit when, for the first time, he heard the voice of the priest. A powerful and experienced voice. It pierced through the reaches of the cathedral, ready, waiting for it. But the priest was not calling out to the congregation. His cry was quite unambiguous, and there was no escape from it. He called Josef K. Kay stood still and looked back down at the floor. In theory, he was still free. He could have carried on walking, through one of the 3 dark little wooden doors not far in front of him and away from there. It would simply mean he had not understood, or that he had understood but chose not to pay attention to it. But if he once turned round, he would be trapped. Then he would have acknowledged that he had understood perfectly well, that he really was the Josef K. the priest had called to, and that he was willing to follow. If the priest had called out again, K. would certainly have carried on out the door. But everything was silent as K. also waited. He turned his head slightly as he wanted to see what the priest was doing now. He was merely standing in the pulpit as before. But it was obvious that he had seen K. turn his head. If Kay did not now turn round completely, it would have been like a child playing hide-and-seek. He did so, and the priest beckoned him with his finger. As everything could now be done openly, he ran, because of curiosity and the wish to get it over with long, flying leaps towards the pulpit. At the front pews he stopped, but to the priest he still seemed too far away. He reached out his hand and pointed sharply down with his finger to a place immediately in front of the pulpit. And Kay did as he was told. Standing in that place, he had to bend his head a long way back just to see the priest. "You are Josef K?" said the priest, and raised his hand from the balustrade to make a gesture whose meaning was unclear. "Yes," said Kay. He considered how freely he had always given his name in the past. For some time now it had been a burden to him. Now there were people who knew his name who he had never seen before. It had been so nice first to introduce yourself, and only then for people to know who you were. "You have been accused," said the priest, especially gently. "Yes," said Kay. "So I have been informed." "Then you are the one I am looking for," said the priest. "I am the prison chaplain." "I see," said Kay. "I had you summoned here," said the priest, "because I wanted to speak to you." "I knew nothing of that," said Kay. "I came here to show the cathedral to a gentleman from Italy." "That is beside the point," said the priest. "What are you holding in your hand? Is it a prayer book?" "No," answered Kay. "It's an album of the city's tourist sites." "Put it down," said the priest. Kay threw it away with such force that it flapped open and rolled across the floor, tearing its pages. "Do you know your case is going badly?" asked the priest. "That's how it seems to me, too," said Kay. I've expended a lot of effort on it, but so far with no result, although I do still have some documents to submit. How do you imagine it will end? Asked the priest. How do you imagine it will end? Asked the priest. Well, at first I thought it was bound to end well, said Kay, but now I have my doubts about it. I don't know how it will end. Do you know? I don't, said the priest, but I fear it will end badly. You are considered guilty. Your case will probably not even go beyond a minor court. Provisionally, at least, your guilt is seen as proven. But I'm not guilty, said Kay. There's been a mistake. How is it even possible for someone to be guilty? We're all human beings here, one like the other. That is true, said the priest. But that is how the guilty speak. Do you presume that I'm guilty too? Asked Kay. I make no presumptions about you, said the priest. I thank you for that, said Kay. But everyone else involved in these proceedings has something against me and presumes I'm guilty. They even influence those who aren't involved. My position gets harder all the time. You don't understand the facts, said the priest. The verdict does not come suddenly. Proceedings continue until a verdict is reached gradually. I see, said Kay, lowering his head. What do you intend to do about your case next? Asked the priest. I still need to find help, said Kay, raising his head to see what the priest thought of this. There are certain possibilities I haven't yet made use of. You look for too much help from people you don't know, said the priest disapprovingly, and especially from women. Can you really not see that's not the help you need? Sometimes, in fact, quite often, I could believe you're right, said Kay, but not always. Women have a lot of power. If I could persuade some of the women I know to work together with me, then I would be certain to succeed, especially in a court like this that seems to consist of nothing but women chasers. Show the examining judge a woman in the distance, and he'll run right after her, and the accused, just to get to her as soon as he can. The priest lowered his head down to the balustrade. Only now did the roof over the pulpit seem to press him down. What sort of dreadful weather could it be outside? It was no longer just a dull day, it was the deepest night. None of the stained glass in the main window shed even a flicker of light on the darkness of the walls. And this was the moment when the man in the cassock chose to put out the candles on the main altar, one by one. Are you cross with me? Asked Kay. Maybe you don't know what sort of court it is you serve. He received no answer. Well, it's just my own experience, said Kay. Above him, there was still silence. I didn't mean to insult you, said Kay. At that, the priest screamed down at Kay. Can you not see 2 steps in front of you? He shouted in anger, but it was also the scream of one who sees another fall and, shocked and without thinking, screams against his own will. The 2 men, then, remained silent for a long time. In the darkness beneath him, the priest could not possibly have seen Kay distinctly, although Kay was able to see him clearly by the light of the little lamp. Why did the priest not come down? He had not given a sermon. He had only told Kay a few things which, if he followed them closely, would probably cause him more harm than good. But the priest certainly seemed to mean well. It might even be possible if he could come down and cooperate with him. It might even be possible for him to obtain some acceptable piece of advice that could make all the difference. It might, for instance, be able to show him not so much to influence the proceedings, but how to break free of them, how to evade them, how to live away from them. Kay had to admit that this was something he had had on his mind quite a lot of late. If the priest knew of such a possibility, he might, if Kay asked him, let him know about it, even though he was part of the court himself, and even though, when Kay had criticized the court, he had held down his gentle nature and actually shouted at Kay. Would you not like to come down here? Asked Kay. If you're not going to give a sermon, come down here with me. Now I can come down, said the priest. Perhaps he regretted having shouted at Kay. As he took down the lamp from its hook, he said, To start off with, I had to speak to you from a distance. Otherwise, I'm too easily influenced and forget my duty. Kay waited for him at the foot of the steps. While he was still on one of the higher steps, as he came down them, the priest reached out his hand for Kay to shake. "Can you spare me a little of your time?" asked Kay. "As much time as you need," said the priest, and passed him the little lamp for him to carry. Even at close distance the priest did not lose a certain solemnity that seemed to be part of his character. "You're very friendly towards me," said Kay, as they walked up and down beside each other in the darkness of one of the side naves. "That makes you an exception among all those who belong to the court. I can trust you more than any of the others I've seen. I can speak openly with you. Don't fool yourself," said the priest. "How would I be fooling myself?" asked Kay. "You fooled yourself in the court," said the priest. "It talks about this self-deceit in the opening paragraphs of the law. In front of the law there is a doorkeeper. A man from the countryside comes up to the door and asks for entry, but the doorkeeper says he can't let him into the law right now. The man thinks about this, and then he asks if he'll be able to go in later on. 'It's possible,' says the doorkeeper, 'but not now.' The gateway to the law is open as it always is, and the doorkeeper has stepped to one side, so the man bends over to try and see in. When the doorkeeper notices this, he laughs and says, 'If you're tempted, give it a try. Try and go even though I say you can't. Careful, though. I'm powerful. And I'm only the lowliest of all the doormen. But there's a doorkeeper for each of the rooms, and each of them is more powerful than the last. It's more than I can stand just to look at a third one.' The man from the country had not expected difficulties like this. The law was supposed to be accessible for anyone, at any time, he thinks. But now he looks more closely at the doorkeeper in his fur coat, sees his big hooked nose, his long, thin Tartar beard, and he decides it's better to wait until he has permission to enter. The doorkeeper gives him a stool and lets him sit down to one side of the gate. He sits there for days and years. He tries to be allowed in time and again and tires the doorkeeper with his requests. The doorkeeper often questions him, asking about where he's from and many other things, but there are disinterested questions such as great men ask, and he always ends up by telling him he still can't let him in. The man had come well equipped for his journey and uses everything, however valuable, to bribe the doorkeeper. He accepts everything, but as he does so, he says, 'I'll only accept this so that you don't think there's anything you've failed to do.' Over many years, the man watches the doorkeeper almost without a break. He forgets about the other doormen and begins to think this one is the only thing stopping him from gaining access to the law. Over the first few years, he curses his unhappy condition out loud, but later, as he becomes old, he just grumbles to himself. He becomes senile, and as he has come to know even the fleas in the doorkeeper's fur coat over the years that he has been studying him, he even asks them to help him and change the doorkeeper's mind. Finally, his eyes grow dim, and he no longer knows whether it's really getting darker or just his eyes that are deceiving him. But he seems now to see an inextinguishable light begin to shine from the darkness behind the door. He doesn't have long to live now. Just before he dies, he brings together all his experience from all this time into one question which he has still never put to the doorkeeper. He beckons to him, as he's no longer able to raise his stiff body. The doorkeeper has to bend over deeply, as the difference in their sizes has changed very much to the disadvantage of the man. "What is it you want to do now?" asked the doorkeeper. "You're insatiable." "Everyone wants access to the law," says the man. "How come over all these years no one but me has asked to be let in?" The doorkeeper can see the man's come to this end. His hearing has faded, and so that he can be heard, he shouts to him, "Nobody else could have got in this way, as this entrance was meant only for you. Now I'll go and close it." "So the doorkeeper cheated the man," said Kate immediately, who had been captivated by the story. "Don't be too quick," said the priest. "Don't take somebody else's opinion without checking it. I told you the story exactly as it was written. There's nothing in there about cheating." "But it's quite clear," said Kay, "and your first interpretation of it was quite correct." The doorkeeper gave him the information that would release him only when it could be of no more use. He didn't ask him before that, said the priest. And don't forget he was only a doorkeeper, and as doorkeeper he did his duty. What makes you think he did his duty? Asked Kay. He didn't. It might have been his duty to keep everyone else away, but this man is who the door was intended for, and he ought to have been let in. You're not paying enough attention to what was written, and you're changing the story, said the priest. According to the story, there are two important things that the doorkeeper explains about the access to the law. One at the beginning, one at the end. At one place he says he cannot allow him in now, and at the other he says this entrance was intended for him alone. If one of the statements contradicted the other, you would be right, and the doorkeeper could have cheated the man from the country. But this is no contradiction. On the contrary, the first statement even hints at the second. You could almost say the doorkeeper went beyond his duty in that he offered the man some prospect of being admitted in the future. Throughout the story, his duty seems to have been merely to turn the man away, and there are many commentators who are surprised that the doorkeeper offered this hint at all, as he seems to love exactitude and keeps strict guard over his position. He stays at his post for many years and doesn't close the gate until the very end. He's very conscious of the importance of his service. As he says, I'm powerful. He has respect for his superiors. As he says, I'm the lowliest of the doormen. He's not talkative, as though all these years the only questions he asks are disinterested. He's not corruptible, as when he's offered a gift he says, I'll only accept this as you don't think there's anything you've failed to do. As far as fulfilling his duty goes, he can be neither ruffled nor begged, as it says about the man that he tires the doorkeeper with his requests. Even his external appearance suggests a pedantic character, the big hooked nose and the long, thin, black Tartar beard. How could any doorkeeper be more faithful to his duty? But in the doorkeeper's character, there are also other features which might be very useful for those who seek entry to the law. And when he hinted at some possibility in the future, it always seemed to make it clear that he might even go beyond his duty. There's no denying he's a little simple-minded, and that makes him a little conceited. If all he said about his power and the power of the other doorkeepers, and how not even he could bear the sight of them, I say even if all these assertions are right, the way he makes them shows that he's too simple and arrogant to understand properly. The commentators say about this that correct understanding of a matter and a misunderstanding of the same matter are not mutually exclusive. Whether they're right or not, you have to concede that this simplicity and arrogance, however little they show, do weaken his function of guarding the entrance. They are defects in the doorkeeper's character. You also have to consider that the doorkeeper seems to be friendly by nature. He isn't always just an official. He makes a joke right at the beginning, in that he invites the man to enter at the same time as maintaining the ban on his entering, and then he doesn't send him away but gives him, as it says in the text, a stool to sit on and lets him stay by the side of the door. The patience with which he puts up with the man's requests through all these years, the little questioning sessions, accepting the gifts, his politeness when he puts up with the man cursing his fate, even though it was the doorkeeper who caused that fate. All these things seem to want to arouse our sympathy. Not every doorkeeper would have behaved in the same way. And finally, he lets the man beckon him, and he bends deep down to him so that he can put his last question. There's no more than some slight impatience. The doorkeeper knows everything's come to its end, shown in the words, "You're insatiable." There are many commentators who go even further in explaining it in this way and think the words "you are insatiable" are an expression of friendly admiration, albeit with some condescension. However, you look at it, the figure of the doorkeeper comes out differently from how you might think. You know the story better than I do, and you've known it for longer, said Kay. They were silent for a while, and then Kay said, So you think the man was not cheated, do you? Don't get me wrong. said the priest. "I'm just pointing out the different opinions about it. You shouldn't pay too much attention to people's opinions. The text cannot be altered, and the various opinions are often no more than an expression of despair over it. There's even one opinion which says it's the doorkeeper who's been cheated." "That does seem to take things a bit too far," said Kay. "How can they argue the doorkeeper has been cheated?" "Their argument," answered the priest, "is based on the simplicity of the doorkeeper. They say the doorkeeper doesn't know the inside of the law, only the way into it, where he just walks up and down. They see his ideas of what's inside the law as rather childish, and suppose he's afraid himself of what he wants to make the man frightened of. Yes, he's more afraid of it than the man, as the man wants nothing but to go inside the law, even after he's heard about the terrible doorman there, in contrast to the doorkeeper who doesn't want to go in, or at least we don't hear anything about it. On the other hand, there are those who say he must have already been inside the law as he has taken on into its service, and that could only have been done inside. That can be counted by supposing he could have been given the job of doorkeeper by somebody calling out from inside, and that he can't have gone very far inside, as he couldn't bear the sight of the third doorkeeper. Nor, through all those years, does the story say the doorkeeper told the man anything about the inside, other than his comment about the other doorkeepers. He could have been forbidden to do so, but he hasn't said anything about that either. All this seems to show he doesn't know anything about what the inside looks like or what it means, and that's why he's being deceived. But he's also being deceived by the man from the country, as he's this man's subordinate and doesn't know it. There's a lot to indicate that he treats the man as his subordinate, I expect you remember, but those who hold this view would say it's very clear that he really is his subordinate. Above all, the free man is superior to the man who has to serve another. Now, the man really is free. He can go wherever he wants. The only thing forbidden to him is entry into the law, and, what's more, there's only one man forbidding him to do so: the doorkeeper. If he takes the stool and sits down beside the door and stays there all his life, he does this of his own free will. There's nothing in the story to say he was forced to do it. On the other hand, the doorkeeper is kept to his post by his employment. He's not allowed to go away from it, and it seems he's not allowed to go inside either, not even if he wanted to. Also, although he's in the service of the law, he's only there for this one entrance. Therefore, he's there only in the service of this one man who the door's intended for. This is another way in which he's his subordinate. We can take it that he's been performing this somewhat empty service for many years. Through the whole of a man's life, as it says that a man will come, that means someone old enough to be a man. That means the doorkeeper will have to wait a long time before his function is fulfilled. He will have to wait for as long as the man liked, who came to the door of his own free will. Even the end of the doorkeeper's service is determined by when the man's life ends, so the doorkeeper remains his subordinate right to the end. And it's pointed out repeatedly that the doorkeeper seems to know nothing of any of this, although this is not seen as anything remarkable, as those who hold this view see the doorkeeper as deluded in a way that's far worse, a way that's to do with his service. At the end, speaking about the entrance, he says, "Now I'll go and close it," although at the beginning of the story it says the door to the law is open as it always is. But if it's always open, always, that means it's open independently of the lifespan of the man it's intended for, and not even the doorkeeper will be able to close it. There are various opinions about this. Some say the doorkeeper was only answering a question or showing his devotion to duty, or just when the man was in his last moments, the doorkeeper wanted to cause him regret and sorrow. There are many who would agree that he wouldn't be able to close the door. They even believe, at the end at least, the doorkeeper is aware, deep down, that he's the man's subordinate, as the man sees the light that shines out of the entry to the law, whereas the doorkeeper would probably have his back to it and say nothing at all to show there's been any change. "That is well substantiated," said Kay, who had been repeating some parts of the priest's explanation to himself in a whisper. It is well substantiated, and now I too think the doorkeeper must have been deceived. Although that does not mean I've abandoned what I thought earlier, as the two versions are, to some extent, not incompatible. It's not clear whether the doorkeeper sees clearly or is deceived. I said the man has been cheated. If the doorkeeper understands clearly, then there could be some doubt about it, but if the doorkeeper has been deceived, then the man is bound to believe the same thing. That would mean the doorkeeper is not a cheat, but so simple-minded that he ought to be dismissed from his job immediately. If the doorkeeper is mistaken, it will do him no harm, but the man will be harmed immensely. There you found another opinion, said the priest, as there are many who say the story doesn't give anyone the right to judge the doorkeeper. However, he might seem to us he is still in the service of the law, so he belongs to the law, so he's beyond what man has a right to judge. In this case, we can't believe the doorkeeper is the man's subordinate. Even if he has to stay at the entrance into the law, his service makes him incomparably more than if he lived freely in the world. The man has come to the law for the first time, and the doorkeeper is already there. He's been given his position by the law. To doubt his worth would be to doubt the law. I can't say I'm in complete agreement with this view, said Kay, shaking his head. As if you accept it, you'll have to accept that everything said by the doorkeeper is true. But you've already explained very fully that that's not possible. No, said the priest. You don't need to accept everything as true. You only need to accept it as necessary. Depressing view, said Kay. The lie made into the rule of the world. Kay said that as if it were his final word, but it was not his conclusion. He was too tired to think about all the ramifications of the story, and the sorts of thoughts they led him into were not familiar to him. Unrealistic things, things better suited for officials of the court to discuss than for him. The simple story had lost its shape. He wanted to shake it off, and the priest, who now felt quite compassionate, allowed this and accepted Kay's remarks without comment, even though his views were certainly very different from Kay's. In silence, they carried on walking for some time. Kay stayed close beside the priest without knowing where he was. The lamp in his hand had long since gone out. Once, just in front of him, he thought he could see the statue of a saint by the glitter of the silver on it, although it quickly disappeared back into the darkness. So that he would not remain entirely dependent on the priest, Kay asked him, "So, we're now near the main entrance, are we?" "No," said the priest. "We're a long way from it. Do you already want to go?" Kay had not thought of going until then, but he immediately said, "Yes, certainly, I have to go. I'm the chief clerk in a bank, and there are people waiting for me. I only came here to show a foreign business contact round the cathedral." "All right," said the priest, offering him his hand. "Go then." "But I can't find my way round in this darkness by myself," said Kay. "Go to your left as far as the wall," said the priest. "Then continue alongside the wall without leaving it, and you'll find a way out." The priest had only gone a few paces from him, but Kay was already shouting loudly, "Please, wait!" "I'm waiting," said the priest. "Is there anything else you want from me?" asked Kay. "No," said the priest. "You were so friendly to me earlier on," said Kay, "and you explained everything, but now you abandon me as if I were nothing to you." "You have to go," said the priest. "Well said." "Well, yes," said Kay. "You need to understand that." "First, you need to understand who I am," said the priest. "You're the prison chaplain," said Kay, and went closer to the priest. It was not so important for him to go straight back to the bank as he had made out. He could very well stay where he was. "So that means I belong to the court," said the priest. "So why would I want anything from you? The court doesn't want anything from you. It accepts you when you come, and it lets you go when you leave." End of chapter 9. Oof. Okay, so what a What a wild ride. I feel like every chapter is like, well, that was weird. What happened? Nobody really knows. There's so much that you can dive into, and I'm thoroughly enjoying Kafka's writing. This is not my first Kafka book, and I am just in awe. Because there's so many different ways of in how you could read this. So, chapter 9, we have Kay at work, and he is supposed to meet an Italian business colleague, and he's supposed to show this guy around the sites. And the guy is like, well, I really only want to see the cathedral. Meet me in 2 hours at this cathedral. And Kay is having this kind of translated. He doesn't really understand Italian, and the accent that this guy has is different than you, so it makes it a little bit harder to understand. And so he goes there at 10 o'clock and the guy isn't there. And so he's just like walking around and there's nobody in the cathedral. And he's like, all right, well, I guess I'll just like wait 30 minutes. And at 11 o'clock, he's like about to leave and he's walking out and the priest yells his name. And so he stops and he turns around and the priest is the prison chaplain because of course he is. Everybody is somehow involved in this. And there's a moment when Kay is like, "Oh, yeah, this is weird." This is weird. Everybody knows who I am. Like I'm used to like introducing myself, blah blah blah. And the priest basically says like I'm the prison chaplain. Your trial is not going well. You are guilty. Everybody knows this. And Kay is like, yeah, I know it's not going well, but I've put in all of this effort and I don't really understand, blah, blah, blah. And then the priest tells him this story of this man from the country who comes to be let into the law. And there's this doorkeeper here, and the doorkeeper just doesn't let him in. And so the man just sits there and waits and has been trying a bunch of different ways to let him in. And then towards the end of the man's life, the doorkeeper is like, all right, you can come in. This entrance was just for you. And so the man goes in, I guess. And so then after that story, the priest and Kay are talking about this and trying to like suss out what's going on, which I am wondering if part of that is also a commentary on how like Kafka's books have been like written about, and like conclusions that have been drawn to be like, well, some people say this, but that's not what's written here, and some people say this, and that's also not what the text it says. And oh, there's also a moment when the priest is like, yeah, you're asking all of the wrong people for help. That's why it's going so terribly. Just a lot of interesting things. Just so many interesting things. And so now Kay's like, yeah, I'm gonna go. All right. Chapter 10. End. The evening before Kay's 31st birthday, it was about 9 o'clock in the evening, the time when the streets were quiet. Two men came to where he lived. In frock coats, pale and fat, wearing top hats that looked like they could not be taken off their heads. After some brief formalities at the door of the flat where they first arrived, the same formalities were repeated at greater length at Kay's door. He had not been notified they would be coming, but Kay sat in a chair near the door, dressed in black as they were, and slowly put on new gloves which stretched tightly over his fingers and behaved as if he were expecting visitors. He immediately stood up and looked at the gentleman inquisitively. "You've come for me, then, have you?" he asked. The gentleman nodded. One of them indicated the other with the top hand now in his hat. With the top hand now in his hand. Kay told them he had been expecting a different visitor. He went to the window and looked once more down at the dark street. Most of the windows on the other side of the street were also dark already. Many of them had the curtains closed. In one of the windows, on the same floor where there was a light on, two small children could be seen playing with each other inside a playpen. Unable to move from where they were, reaching out for each other with their little hands. Some ancient, unimportant actors. That's what they've sent for me, said Kay to himself, and looked round once again to confirm this for himself. They want to sort me out as cheaply as they can. Kay suddenly turned round to face the two men and asked, "What theater do you play in?" "Theater?" asked one of the gentlemen, turning to the other for assistance, and pulling in the corners of his mouth. The other made a gesture like someone who was dumb, as if he were struggling with some organism causing him trouble. "You're not properly prepared to answer questions," said Kay, and went to fetch his hat. As soon as they were on the stairs, the gentleman wanted to take Kay's arms, but Kay said, "Wait till we're in the street. I'm not ill." But they waited only until the front door before they took his arms in a way that Kay had never experienced before. They kept their shoulders close behind his, did not turn their arms in, but twisted them around the entire length of Kay's arms and took hold of his hands with a grasp that was formal, experienced, and could not be resisted. Kay was held stiff and upright between them. They formed now a single unit, so that if any one of them had been knocked down, all of them must have fallen. They formed a unit of the sort that normally can be formed only by matters that is lifeless. Whenever they passed under a lamp, Kay tried to see his companions more clearly, as far as was possible when they were pressed so close together, as in the dim light of his room this had been hardly possible. Maybe they're tenors, he thought as he saw their big double chins. The cleanliness of their faces disgusted him. He could see the hands that cleaned them, passing over the corners of their eyes, rubbing at their upper lips, scratching out the creases on those chins. When Kay noticed that, he stopped, which meant the others had to stop too. They were at the edge of an open square devoid of people, but decorated with flower beds. "Why did they send you? Of all people?" he cried out, more a shout than a question. The two gentlemen clearly knew no answer to give. They waited, their free arms hanging down like nurses when the patient needs to rest. "I will go no further," said Kay, as if to see what would happen. The gentlemen did not need to make an answer. It was enough that they did not loosen their grip on Kay and tried to move him on, but Kay resisted them. "I'll soon have no need of much strength. I'll use all of it now," he thought. He thought of the flies that tear their legs off struggling to get free of fly paper. These gentlemen will have some hard work to do. Just then, Miss Bursner came up into the square in front of them from the steps leading from a small street at a lower level. It was not certain that it was her, although the similarity was, of course, great. But it did not matter to Kay. Whether it was certainly her anyway, he became suddenly aware that there was no point in his resistance. There would be nothing heroic about it if he resisted, if he now caused trouble for these gentlemen, if in defending himself he sought to enjoy his last glimmer of life. He started walking, which pleased the gentlemen, and some of their pleasure conveyed itself to him. Now they permitted him to decide which direction they took, and he decided to take the direction that followed the young woman in front of them, not so much because he wanted to catch up with her, nor even because he wanted to keep her in sight for as long as possible, but only so that he would not forget the reproach she represented for him. "The only thing I can do now," he said to himself, and his thought was confirmed by the equal length of his own steps with the steps of the other two. "The only thing I can do now is keep my common sense, and do what's needed right till the end. I always wanted to go at I always wanted to go at the world and try to do too much, and even to do it for something that was not too cheap. That was wrong of me. Should I now show them I learned nothing from facing trial for a year? Should I go out like someone stupid? Should I let anyone say after I'm gone that at the start of the proceedings I wanted to end them, and that now that they've ended, I want to start them again? I don't want anyone to say that. I'm grateful they sent these unspeaking, uncomprehending men to go with me on this journey, and that it's been left up to me to say what's necessary." Meanwhile, the young woman had turned off into the side street, but Kay could do without her now, and let his companions lead him. All three of them now, in complete agreement, went over a bridge in the light of the moon. The two gentlemen were willing to yield to each little movement made by Kay, as he moved slightly towards the edge and directed the group in that direction as a single unit. The moonlight glittered and quivered in the water, which divided itself around a small island covered in a densely piled mass of foliage and trees and bushes. Beneath them, now invisible, there were gravel paths with comfortable benches where Kay had stretched himself out on many summer days. I didn't actually want to stop here, he said to his companions, shamed by their compliance with his wishes. Behind Kay's back, one of them seemed to quietly criticize the other for misunderstanding about stopping, and then they went on. They went on up through several streets where policemen were walking or standing here and there, some in the distance and some very close. One of them, with a bushy mustache, his hand on the grip of his sword, seemed to have some purpose in approaching the group, which was hardly unsuspicious. The two gentlemen stopped. The policeman seemed about to open his mouth, and then Kay drove his group forcefully forward. Several times he looked back cautiously to see if the policeman was following, but when they had a corner between themselves and the policeman, Kay began to run. And the two gentlemen, despite being seriously short of breath, had to run with him. In this way they quickly left the built-up area and found themselves in the fields which, in this part of town, began almost without any transition zone. There was a quarry, empty and abandoned, near a building which was still like those in the city. Here the men stopped, perhaps because this had always been their destination, or because perhaps they were too exhausted to run any further. Here they released their hold on Kay, who just waited in silence and took their top hats off while they looked round the quarry and wiped the sweat off their brows with their handkerchiefs. The moonlight lay everywhere with the natural peace that is granted to no other light. After exchanging a few courtesies about who was to carry out the next tasks, the gentlemen did not seem to have been allocated specific functions. One of them went to Kay and took his coat, his waistcoat, and finally his shirt off him. Kay made an involuntary shiver, at which the gentleman gave him a gentle, reassuring tap on the back. Then he carefully folded the things up as if they would still be needed, even if not in the near future. He did not want to expose Kay to the chilly night air without moving, though, so he took him under the arm and walked up and down with him a little way while the other gentleman looked round the quarry for a suitable place. When he had found it, he made a sign, and the other gentleman escorted him there. It was near the rock face. There was a stone lying there that had broken loose. The gentleman sat Kay down on the ground, leaned him against the stone, and settled his head down on the top of it. Despite all the effort they went to, and despite all the cooperation shown by Kay, his demeanor seemed very forced and hard to believe. So one of the gentlemen asked the other to grant him a short time while he put Kay in position by himself. But even that did nothing to make it better. In the end, they left Kay in a position that was far from the best of the ones they had tried so far. Then one of the gentlemen opened his frock coat, and from a sheath hanging on a belt stretched across his waistcoat, he withdrew a long, thin, double-edged butcher knife, which he held up in the light to test its sharpness. The repulsive courtesies began once again. One of them passed the knife over to Kay, to the other. Passed the knife over Kay to the other, who then passed it back over Kay to the first. Kay now knew it would be his duty to take the knife as it passed from hand to hand above him and thrust it into himself. But he did not do it. Instead, he twisted his neck, which was still free, and looked around. He was not able to show his full worth, was not able to take all the work from the official bodies. He lacked the rest of the strength he needed, and this final shortcoming was the fault of whoever had denied it to him. As he looked around, he saw the top floor of the building next to the quarry. He saw how a light flickered on and the two halves of a window opened out. Somebody, made weak and thin by the height and the distance, leant suddenly far out from it and stretched his arms out even further. Who was that? A friend? A good person? Somebody who was taking part? Somebody who wanted to help? Was he alone? Was it anyone? Would anyone help? Were there objections that had been forgotten? There must have been some. The logic cannot be refuted. But someone who wants to live will not resist it. Where was the judge he'd never seen? Where was the high court he had never reached? He raised both hands and spread out all his fingers. But the hands of one of the gentlemen were laid on Kay's throat, while the other pushed the knife deep into his heart and twisted it there, twice. As his eyesight failed, Kay saw the two gentlemen cheek by cheek, close in front of his face, watching the result. Like a dog, he said. It was as if the shame of it should outlive him. The end. Ooh, what? What? Okay, so this last chapter, it is the eve before Kay's 31st birthday, and he is visited by two officials. And he makes comments on them like, why are they the oldest officials he's ever seen? Why are they dim-witted? Why are they people who just don't talk? And so he has kind of accepted his fate, and Kay puts his hat on and goes out with them and is like, you don't need to like guide me, I'm not ill, like just, you can grab my arms when I'm outside. But they don't really listen. They like grab his arms pretty immediately, and they're leading him around, and it seems like Kay is able to decide which way he goes. And so at first he follows a woman, not because he, is interested in her or thinks that she'll be able to help, but because he's interested in the reproach that she gave, like that reproachful look and manner that she had. And so he follows her for a little bit and then just accepts that the time is now. And he stops at a park that he used to go to and is like, oh wait, I didn't really mean to stop here. And so they keep walking, and there's a point where they take his coat, his overcoat, his shirt, and like they don't want him to walk in the cold, so they're kind of sheltering him as well. And then one of them takes out like a really long butcher knife and like holds it up into the sky to like check the sharpness of it. And then they pass the butcher knife to and fro over Kay, and Kay knows that what is expected of him is to grab the knife and for him to like stab himself with it. But he's not going to do that. Instead, he just like looks around and looks up, and one of the guys grabs him by the neck, and then the other one stabs him and twists the knife in his heart. Brutal. And then the last line is said, like a dog, which is so interesting because he was comparing the businessman a couple chapters ago to a dog. Ooh, ooh, I liked this. I didn't know what was going on most of the time. Like, there's a lot going on with this, but it definitely lends itself to reading more than once, because I feel like this is the type of book that you're going to find new things each time you read it. And kind of like the story of what the priest was saying, like, there's so many different ways to read something, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that is the right way to read something. Like, all of this extrapolated theories aren't necessarily right in how things should or can or will be interpreted. So I just find that interesting. And yeah, there is a lot of commentary, but is that really what is going on here? Is that really what is being said? Or are we reading too much into it? Are we putting our own experiences and things like that into a story that is just weird? But I really liked this book. I really like it. And this is the second Kafka book that I have read, and I am officially a fan. Officially. Officially. But yeah, that's it. We did it. We done finished the book. And that's gonna be it for tonight. But thank you all for being here. It is a pleasure. As always, whether you lurk, whether you chat, I 1000% appreciate you. And I 1000% appreciate your support. If I don't see you next time, not only will I be sad, but I hope to see you very soon. Goodbye.